Close your eyes and let the sea breathe for you. Hear the hush of wind against steel, the low thrum of engines, the distant echo of a foghorn rolling across cold gray water. Tonight on Lullaby of Empire, we drift upon the broad Atlantic, a graveyard and a lifeline, where for nearly 6 years, ships in long dark columns threaded their way through storms and hunters, bearing bread for families, fuel for engines, and hope for nations. This is the longest battle of the Second World War. Not a single clash of banners, but an unending pulse of crossings and returns, a quiet arithmetic of tonnage and lives. You'll meet the sailors whose hands bled on frozen rails, the young men sealed in iron shadows beneath the waves, the escorts carving crescents through sleet and spray, the codebreakers listening to the ether for the clues that would save a convoy before dawn. We'll begin at the very first signal of danger and drift through the years, when the ocean seemed to belong to the hunters, then onward to the months when the hunters became the hunted, and finally to the calm that followed the storm, when the sea remembered the names of the lost. If you're new here, welcome. This is Lullaby of Empire, where we let the echoes of history carry you into calm. If the weight of the day is heavy, set it down beside you. Dim the light. Let your breathing fall into the rhythm of the swell, in and out, like the tide. If you find peace in stories told softly, stories of courage, endurance, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people, consider subscribing, tapping the like button, and sharing this with someone who might need a gentler night. And if you drift to sleep along the way, that's all right. The ocean will keep the rest of the watch. Tonight's journey is told in 20 chapters, each a single, unbroken wave of words. We'll weave together the lived textures you shared, the U-boat hunts, the convoy's dread, the codebreakers' hum of logic with what I remember, the aircraft that closed the black pit, the escort carriers bringing wings to the waves, the names of battles etched in oil and ice. Settle in, the anchors are all weighed. History will be gentle. Chapter 1. The longest battle begins. It began not with the roar of artillery or the thunder of tanks across a continent, but with the whisper of waves against steel hulls and the distant hum of engines vanishing into mist. The Battle of the Atlantic was unlike any other in the Second World War, not fought for land or cities, but for survival itself, for the unseen arteries that connected the free world across a vast and merciless ocean. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, it set in motion a struggle that would stretch unbroken for nearly 6 years, longer than any other campaign, fought over an expanse that defied the imagination. The Atlantic, cold, gray, and endless, became the lifeline of a besieged island, the single thread that bound Britain to its allies and to hope. From the first days of conflict, it was clear that this would be no quick or glamorous war. It was a war of endurance, of invisible duels beneath the waves and sleepless nights above them, where every ship that vanished beneath the surface carried with it not just cargo, but the fragile pulse of nations. For Britain, the sea was both shield and weakness. Its empire, scattered across the globe, could feed its people and fuel its armies only through the lanes of the Atlantic, where merchant convoys hauled wheat from Canada, oil from America, and raw materials from distant colonies. 9 out of every 10 tons of supplies came by ship. Without them, factories would grind to a halt, shelves would empty, and the lights of London would flicker out for good. In the darkened rooms of the Admiralty, this truth hung heavy. To lose the Atlantic was to lose the war. The men of the Merchant Navy knew it too, though they were not soldiers in the usual sense. They were civilians, turned combatants by necessity, their ships laden with cargo instead of cannons, their battlefields measured in miles of ocean instead of front lines. They sailed knowing that every voyage might be their last, and yet they sailed anyway, bound not by discipline but by duty, courage, and the knowledge that their journey kept a nation alive. Against them, Germany unleashed its most feared weapon, the Unterseeboot, the U-boat, a silent predator gliding beneath the waves. The lessons of the First World War had not been forgotten by the men who commanded these steel wolves. Admiral Karl Dönitz, a submariner by trade and conviction, believed utterly in their power. To him, the submarine was the perfect weapon of attrition, unseen, unstoppable, and unrelenting. Where battleships sought glory, his U-boats sought results. His vision was not of grand engagements, but of strangulation. He understood that Britain, islanded and dependent on trade, could be bled dry if its lifelines were severed. His calculations were as cold as the Atlantic itself. Sink more tonnage than the enemy could replace, and the island would starve. In 1939, he possessed only 57 operational boats, far fewer than he needed, but he had faith that the ocean itself would multiply their strength. His strategy was simple in theory and deadly in practice. The U-boats would form wolf packs, coordinated groups that stalked convoys, striking under the cover of night when the sea and sky became one. They would communicate by radio, each submarine relaying sightings and movements, converging on their prey like sharks drawn to blood. For Dönitz and his men, this was more than warfare. It was mathematics made lethal, an equation of tonnage and time. The early months of the war proved his theory right. Within hours of Britain's declaration of war, U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner Athenia, sending more than 100 civilians to their deaths. It was a grim omen of what was to come. As the U-boats spread across the shipping lanes, ships vanished into the depths almost daily. Some sank in flames, others slipped silently beneath the waves without a trace. The ocean became a graveyard of twisted steel and drifting lifeboats. In London, reports arrived faster than they could be read. Freighters missing, tankers sunk. Survivors picked up half dead from the cold. Yet even as the toll mounted, the convoys kept sailing. To stop would be to surrender, and surrender was unthinkable. On the gray decks of escort destroyers, young sailors scanned the waves for periscopes that came and went like ghosts. They were the shield of the merchantmen, their ships smaller, their lives no less fragile. The Royal Navy's war in the Atlantic was one of vigilance and exhaustion. The men slept in their uniforms, ate between alarms, and listened to the sea through the constant hum of engines and sonar pings. When the U-boats struck, it happened in an instant. A flash of light on the horizon, the boom of an explosion, and then chaos. Men leapt into lifeboats as ships rolled onto their sides and slid beneath the waves. The destroyers raced through the darkness, dropping depth charges that shook the sea like thunder, but the hunters had already vanished into silence. Each encounter was a lesson written in loss. The early months were a time of improvisation and desperate adaptation. Britain resurrected the convoy system from the previous war, grouping ships together for safety, but there were never enough escorts to go around. The convoys stretched across miles, their formations loose and vulnerable. Old destroyers were pulled from reserve, some dating back to the Great War, their hulls rusted but still seaworthy. Aircraft patrolled the coastal waters, though their range left a deadly gap in the mid-Atlantic, a black pit where no help could reach. It was here that the U-boats struck hardest, surfacing under the cover of darkness to deliver their torpedoes before slipping away into the deep. By the winter of 1939, the ocean was a killing ground. Yet through it all, the spirit of the men at sea never broke. They faced storms that hurled ice across their decks, engines that froze in the cold, and the ever-present dread of an unseen enemy. They learned to read the sea as they read their own breath. The difference between life and death, measured in a ripple, a shadow, a flicker of light. They prayed for dawn, and when it came, it revealed not safety, but smoke on the horizon and the bitter smell of burning oil. Still, they pressed on. The war in the Atlantic was fought not in days or weeks, but in years, a slow, grinding duel between endurance and extinction. Each ship that reached port was a victory, each that vanished a tragedy swallowed by salt water. And yet, beneath the terror, there was an unspoken kinship among those who fought it. The merchantmen, the escorts, even the submariners, all shared the same sea, the same fear, the same longing for home. The German sailors, young and proud, believed they were striking a blow for their nation's survival, just as the British believed they were defending theirs. They were enemies by circumstance, brothers by fate. The Atlantic spared neither side mercy. Its storms cared nothing for uniforms or flags. Its cold claimed all who fell into it. And so the battle continued, unrelenting, unseen by the world, yet shaping the course of everything that followed. For without victory on the sea, no invasion could be launched, no supplies delivered, no freedom preserved. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a battle for glory. It was a battle for breath, the slow, desperate breathing of nations that refused to drown. And as the war deepened, its waves would grow darker still, the hunters more ruthless, and the struggle more total. But in these early days, when the outcome was uncertain and the world held its breath, a single truth emerged from the fog. The fate of civilization would be decided not only on land or in the skies, but upon the endless gray ocean where men fought not to conquer, but to endure. Chapter 2. The Wolfpack's Rise. The ocean in 1940 had become a living creature, vast and restless, breathing fog and wind, its heart beating to the rhythm of ships and submarines crossing its depths. Beneath those dark, heaving waters, the predators moved sleek and patient, guided by voices carried on invisible radio waves. Admiral Karl Dönitz's vision was now in full motion, and the gray wolves of the Kriegsmarine were unleashed. The U-boat was not a mighty vessel of steel and grandeur like a battleship. It was small, cramped, and smelled of diesel, sweat, and fear. Yet, in its narrow hull, lived a new breed of warrior young men barely out of their teens, who called themselves the Hunters of the Deep. Their commander had drilled into them a belief that they were the decisive force of the war, the sharp edge that could bring an empire to its knees. He told them that their purpose was not glory but arithmetic, that each ship they sank was another pulse of life cut from Britain's heart. To them, the war was not measured in victories or defeats, but in tonnage sunk, in the slow bleeding of an island nation that could not live without the sea. And so, under the rolling clouds of the Atlantic, the wolfpacks gathered. They did not hunt alone. When one U-boat sighted a convoy, it became the signal for the rest, a single set of coordinates transmitted in brief, coded bursts that brought others racing across the waves. Soon, a dozen or more submarines would converge, spread out like shadows in the dark, waiting for the night to fall. Then, as the world turned black and the wind howled across the sea, the attack began. On the surface, where the submarines could move faster than underwater, they darted in between the columns of merchantmen like wolves among sheep. Torpedoes streaked through the black water, invisible until they struck, and then the night erupted in fire. Explosions rolled across the waves, ships broke apart, and men were thrown into oil-slicked seas. The convoys scattered in panic as escorts raced to fight an enemy they could barely see. Depth charges thundered, shaking the water into boiling froth, but the U-boats were gone, diving deep, silent, waiting for the next chance to strike. For those trapped on the burning ships, there was no time to think, only to act to cut the lifeboats free, to leap into freezing water that numbed the skin within seconds, to cling to debris, while praying that rescue might come. But rescue rarely did. The ocean was too wide, the night too cruel. When dawn came, it revealed only drifting wreckage and the long, slow swell of waves where ships had once been. Each convoy that sailed from Halifax or New York carried more than cargo, it carried the lifeblood of the war, and each loss was a wound that the Allies could scarcely afford. Yet for the Germans, these victories were intoxicating. In the ports of occupied France, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire U-boats returned from patrols, flying the black and white ensign of the Kriegsmarine, their hulls streaked with rust and salt, their crews grinning with exhaustion and pride. They were greeted as heroes by their commanders, toasted with beer, photographed for propaganda, their names printed in newspapers across the Reich. Commanders like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke became legends, the aces of the Atlantic, men who seemed to defy the odds patrol after patrol, sinking ships by the dozen. To German civilians reading of their exploits, they were the embodiment of daring and courage, striking blows against the British Empire that had once ruled the waves. But behind the triumphs lay a darker truth. For every victory, the sea took its toll. Crews returned to find friends gone, their boats overdue, and never heard from again. The U-boat bases were lined with the names of the missing, carved in cold stone. The average life expectancy of a submariner was shrinking with each month. Yet still they volunteered, drawn by pride, patriotism, and the strange allure of the hunt. The sea offered no mercy, but it gave meaning to those who served upon it. Inside a U-boat, life was a constant trial. Space was so tight that men slept in shifts, sharing bunks still warm from the body of the last occupant. The air was thick with diesel fumes, stale bread, and human breath. Fresh water was rationed, shaving and washing were luxuries none could afford. Food spoiled quickly, and by the third week at sea, meals were reduced to canned rations and ersatz coffee. Every sound carried weight. The creak of metal under pressure, the hiss of pumps, the thud of footsteps overhead. When the submarine dove deep, every man listened to the groaning hull, aware that the ocean was trying to crush them. They lived suspended between life and death, each patrol a gamble with fate, yet camaraderie was their strength, a bond forged in the claustrophobic, dark, stronger than family, unbroken even in fear. They sang songs, shared jokes, and carved tiny tokens of luck, believing that courage and ritual might keep them alive. Above them, the Atlantic stretched indifferent and endless. Storms battered the convoys, scattering them across miles of sea, while fog cloaked the hunters and the hunted alike. It was a war fought not only against the enemy, but against the elements themselves. The men of the Royal Navy, sailing in corvettes and destroyers, faced equal hardship, their ships pitched and rolled in waves taller than buildings, their decks coated in ice, their clothes perpetually soaked. They lived on black coffee and cold rations, their only comfort the brief warmth of the mess below deck. At night, they scanned the horizon for the faint glow of a periscope, knowing that a torpedo could come at any moment. The sonar operators listened with aching ears, straining to catch the faint echo of Endoside, an approaching submarine. When the signal came, it sent a jolt through the ship, engines roaring. Depth charges rolled over the stern, explosions shaking the sea. The hunt was brutal and uncertain. Sometimes the water turned red, and sometimes it turned still. The Atlantic was vast, and for every U-boat destroyed, 10 more seemed to appear. The British called it the longest battle, but to those who fought it, it was an unending nightmare, a duel fought without sleep or mercy. By the winter of 1940, the balance was tilting dangerously. With the fall of France, the U-boats now had bases along the western coast of Europe, giving them direct access to the deep Atlantic. They no longer had to slip past the narrow channels around Britain. They could sail straight into the convoy routes, spending more time hunting and less time traveling. For Dönitz, it was the realization of his dream. From his headquarters in Lorient, he directed operations with meticulous precision, moving his wolves like pieces on a chessboard. Convoy after convoy was ambushed. Ships went down faster than they could be built. Grain, fuel, weapons, all lost to the depths. In Britain, the losses mounted so fast that Churchill feared the nation might starve before the year was out. He later admitted that the U-boat menace was the only thing that truly frightened him, and with good reason. Every ton of shipping lost was another step toward collapse. Yet, even in the darkest moments, the fight continued. The convoys sailed on, the escorts held their lines, and the scientists in Britain and America worked tirelessly to find answers to develop better sonar, stronger radar, and faster ships. The sea became a laboratory of desperation, where technology and human courage intertwined. By 1941, the Allies began to sense a shift, faint but real. The wolf packs still prowled, but they were no longer invisible. Their own success had betrayed them. the very radio signals that coordinated their attacks could now be tracked, their movements triangulated by Allied direction finding. Intelligence, patience, and persistence were beginning to erode the U-boat's advantage. But for now, in these early years, the ocean still belonged to the hunters. Their victories lit up the night sky with burning oil and broken ships. The men who fought them, sailors, airmen, and civilians alike, would remember the smell of smoke and salt, the sight of the horizon glowing red, and the sound of waves closing over another grave. It was a war without front lines, without pause, without mercy. And yet within that cruelty lived moments of extraordinary humanity. A German captain surfacing to rescue survivors from a torpedoed ship, a British escort risking itself to pull strangers from the sea, men on both sides staring at each other across the waves and realizing they were not so different. The Atlantic, for all its violence, bound them together in fate. It was not merely a battlefield but a mirror, reflecting the endurance and fragility of those who dared to cross it. As 1941 dawned, the wolf packs grew bolder, their reach extending ever wider. The convoy routes stretched across a world at war, and somewhere beneath those endless waves, the next attack was already being planned. The ocean waited, vast and patient, and the longest battle of the war was only just beginning its terrible rhythm. Chapter 3: The Convoy, Lifeline. By the spring of 1941, the Atlantic had become a corridor of courage and fear, a vast gray artery through which the very heartbeat of the Allied world pulsed, carrying food, oil, weapons, and hope toward the besieged island of Britain, and every mile of that water was contested by unseen predators. The convoys that crept across the ocean were slow, clumsy, and vulnerable. Yet they were lifelines more vital than any fortress or army. For without them, the lights of London would dim, the factories would fall silent, and the armies fighting in Africa and the Middle East would wither. Each convoy was a miniature world, a floating city of tankers, freighters, and passenger liners bound together in tight columns, guarded by a ring of destroyers, corvettes, and trawlers bristling with depth charges. Sailors called it the March of the Damned, for every voyage meant weeks of monotony pierced by minutes of terror. On the bridge, officers scanned the horizon through salt-streaked binoculars, counting ships to be sure none had slipped from formation. In the engine rooms, men worked half-naked in heat and noise that never ceased. And in the tiny mess decks, cooks ladled out thin stew to crews who ate quickly, never far from the call-to-action stations. Above all loomed the knowledge that somewhere out there, beneath the rolling waves, were the gray wolves, listening, waiting, patient as death. For those in the merchant fleet, bravery was not a burst of heroism but an act of endurance. They were civilians, fishermen, dockhands, students called to a service few would ever praise, their pay meager, their conditions brutal, their risk absolute. Yet they sailed, again and again, through fog, ice, and storm, because the world depended on them. In Liverpool and Halifax, families watched them depart with quiet dread, knowing that a telegram might be all that ever returned. The Royal Navy did what it could. Escort commanders studied new tactics, zigzagging courses, tighter formations, and the discipline of radio silence. At night, the convoys moved without lights, their ships blacked out so completely that even the stars seemed brighter than their decks. Sailors learned to navigate by instinct, by the faint phosphorescence of waves or the dim silhouette of the ship ahead. A single error could mean collision or separation, and separation meant death. The U-boats preferred the night, surfacing to glide unseen on diesel engines, closing in until their targets filled the periscope. Then came the torpedoes, streaks of compressed air and steel, and seconds later, the sea exploded. The shock wave tore through hulls, scattering men and cargo into the freezing dark. Survivors remembered the smell of burning oil, the cries of the wounded, the eerie hiss of steam escaping ruptured boilers. For those still aboard nearby ships, the command was always the same: hold course, maintain formation, To stop for the dying was to invite destruction. It was a cruelty learned only through necessity, and it haunted the sailors long after the war. The escorts counterattacked with fury depth, charges rolling over the stern, their timed fuses thundering below in patterns meant to crush the unseen enemy, but the ocean offered too many hiding places. The U-boats slipped away into silence, listening for the fading hum of propellers before rising again to strike. It was a game of cat and mouse played in 3 dimensions, and the price of every mistake was measured in lives. Yet slowly, the convoy system began to prove its worth. A convoy might lose 2 or 3 ships in a night, but a lone freighter, sailing independently, had almost no chance at all. The math of survival was cold but clear. Together they stood a fighting chance. British shipyards worked around the clock to replace losses, launching Liberty and Empire ships faster than the enemy could sink them. In those same yards, women welded steel, riveted plates, and built engines, their faces lit by sparks, their hands blistered but steady. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought only by sailors. It was fought by everyone who built, loaded, or prayed over a ship. On the other side, in the pens at Lorient and Brest, German crews prepared for patrols that would stretch for months. Their boats were serviced, torpedoes loaded, the hulls painted black. Before departure, a band sometimes played, and families waved from the quay, though most knew the odds. When the harbor gates opened and the U-boats slipped into the open sea, only a few would return. Inside, the men endured heat, stench, and confinement, the air growing foul with each day submerged. Yet they believed in their mission, convinced that one more sinking might turn the tide of the war. The wolf packs expanded, coordinated by radio from shore, and the convoys grew larger in response, a duel of escalation with no respite. Weather became both ally and enemy. Winter gales scattered ships and drowned men as surely as torpedoes, but storms also shielded them from attack. The North Atlantic was a monstrous thing. Waves towering like cliffs, winds shrieking through rigging, decks sheathed in ice. Men moved with ropes tied around their waists so they would not be swept overboard. In those moments, enemy and ally alike were reduced to survival. The ocean made no distinction, it swallowed them both. When the weather cleared, aircraft joined the fray. Catalinas and Sunderlands flying from coastal bases, their crews peering down at the endless gray below. They carried depth charges and flares, but their range was limited, leaving a central void in mid-ocean known as the Black Pit, where no air cover could reach. It was here that the wolf packs feasted, and here that the convoys prayed for speed. In the wardrooms of escort captains, maps were marked with pins showing sinkings and sightings, and every report told the same grim story. The sea was bleeding ships faster than they could be built. Churchill called the struggle the only thing that ever really frightened me. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when reports of losses arrived from the Admiralty, he was right to be afraid. Yet even fear could not stop the convoys. In that persistence lay their power. Every freighter that reached port carried more than cargo. It carried proof that the Atlantic could still be crossed, that hope could still endure. Dock workers cheered when a convoy limped into Liverpool with half its ships gone, for it meant the other half had survived. The sight of cranes lifting crates of the tired, wheat, oil drums, and munitions from battered decks was a small act of victory, repeated again and again until it became habit. Behind the statistics and strategies, there were faces. A stoker named Murphy, who kept the engines running until the boiler burst. A Norwegian steward who gave his life jacket to another man. A wireless operator tapping out SOS as flames closed in. An escort captain whose ship vanished in a flash of light after rescuing survivors. Their names filled no newspapers, but their endurance was the spine of the Allied world. To sail those convoys was to exist in a state between life and legend, to move through days of dull routine and nights of terror, to see friends vanish and still carry on. They joked, they cursed, they sang, they wept, and they sailed again. By late 1941, the system that had begun in desperation had become a rhythm, a heartbeat that no longer faltered. The wolves still hunted, but the herds had learned to move together. The convoys had become not merely formations of ships, but symbols of defiance, slow-moving, stubborn, unbroken against an ocean that sought to devour them. And as their wakes stretched westward under the pale light of dawn, the men who watched from the decks could almost believe that the sea itself was beginning to change, that somewhere beyond the horizon, a turn in fortune was waiting. The Atlantic, once an empty wilderness, had become the stage on which the fate of nations played out, and though the actors were weary, the performance would continue until the final curtain of war descended. Chapter 4. The Darkest Hours. By the winter of 1941, the Atlantic had become a graveyard of ships, a place where steel and souls sank together beneath the endless gray waves, and where hope flickered like the dying embers of a storm lantern on a heaving deck. The convoys still sailed, bound by duty and desperation, their formations crawling across the cold ocean like wounded beasts, while beneath them, the wolf packs prowled with growing hunger. Admiral Dönitz, now hailed by Hitler as the master of the underwater war, expanded his fleet with ruthless precision, dispatching submarines in coordinated groups that struck by night and vanished by dawn. The Allies called it the happy time. But the term carried a bitter irony, for it was happy only for the hunters. For Britain, it was a time of despair, when the sea seemed to devour everything sent across it. Convoys vanished without trace, tankers exploded in pillars of flame that lit the horizon for miles, and sailors spoke of the ocean itself turning against them. Each week brought news of another disaster. Merchantmen split in two, escorts blown apart, survivors adrift for days before the cold took them. The statistics grew monstrous. Hundreds of ships lost, millions of tons of cargo gone to the depths, and with every sinking, the lifeline to Britain thinned. The island's food reserves dwindled to weeks, fuel to days. In London, blackout curtains sealed the fear inside every home, and Churchill confessed to his aides that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only front that could truly end the war before it was won. Yet the battle raged on, unseen by most, fought in darkness and storm, where death came, not with the roar of armies, but with the quiet hiss of a torpedo. For the men aboard the U-boats, it was a strange kind of triumph, grim, cold, and mechanical. They stalked their prey with discipline, tracking convoys by hydrophone, surfacing only to attack. When the order came torpedoes lows, they felt a jolt of satisfaction, the culmination of endless hours spent in silence and confinement. Through the periscope, they saw ships erupt in fire, heard the muffled thunder of explosions reverberating through the hull. Some cheered, others turned away, their faces ghostly in the dim red light. Then came the counterattack, the rush to dive deep, the sudden plunge as water crashed over the conning tower, the desperate effort to evade the destroyers above. Depth charges fell like hammers from the heavens, each detonation a monstrous blow that rattled teeth and bones. Lights flickered, gauges spun, pipes burst, and still the commander whispered for silence. Men held their breath as the hull groaned under pressure, the air thick with oil and fear. Minutes felt like eternity, and in that eternity, they faced themselves, their faith, their mortality, their place in a war that seemed infinite. When at last the danger passed, when the sonar pings faded into distance, the relief was wordless, heavy, and hollow. The crew would surface again into the night, gulping fresh air, that stank of diesel and salt, the ocean around them littered with wreckage. The enemy was dead, but so were their own illusions of invincibility. For every triumph, the sea demanded a price. In those same nights, aboard the Allied escorts, men lived through the other side of the terror. The sound of sonar, steady, rhythmic, then suddenly alive with contact, was the heartbeat of survival. The destroyers lunged toward the signal, engines screaming, crews rushing to battle stations. Depth charges were set, rolled, and launched, their detonations sending geysers of water into the storm. The sailors could not see their enemy, only feel him a shadow in the dark, a whisper beneath the waves. When oil rose to the surface, they cheered, believing they had struck true. Yet even as they celebrated, another torpedo might already be on its way from a different direction. The sea allowed no rest. In one haunting night in February 1941, convoy HX-109 was ambushed by a pack of 8 U-boats. Within hours, 12 ships were burning, their cargoes of grain and oil lighting the winter sky like floating pyres. The escorts fought valiantly, sinking 2 submarines, but the rest slipped away into the storm. Survivors clung to debris, their faces lit by the glow of the fires, hearing the screams fade as the sea swallowed them. A single lifeboat drifted for 3 days before a corvette found it, the men inside frozen where they Saturday. Such scenes repeated again and again, until even victory began to feel indistinguishable from loss. The ocean did not care who won or died, it only remembered. In the ports of Germany, U-boat crews were hailed as heroes. Banners waved, bands played, and propaganda newsreels showed their commanders shaking hands with admirals. But in the quiet corners of those celebrations, widows wept. For every boat that returned, another was overdue. By late 1941, nearly half of the original U-boat fleet was gone, resting in graves of steel at the bottom of the sea. The sailors who survived knew the odds. Yet they sailed again, bound by comradeship and the unspoken fatalism that had become their creed. To them, the sea was not an enemy, it was destiny. In Britain, the Admiralty fought back with every weapon it could muster. Convoy tactics improved. New technologies, radar, sonar, and high-frequency direction finding began to give the defenders a glimpse of the invisible enemy. Yet these tools were fragile and few. The escorts were still outnumbered, and the enemy's advantage lay in coordination. Donitz's Wolfpack system worked because of communication. Short bursts of coded messages that directed submarines toward their targets. What the Germans did not yet know was that those very messages were being hunted as well. In a nondescript mansion in the English countryside, at a place called Bletchley Park, mathematicians and linguists worked in silence, breaking the codes that Dönitz believed unbreakable. The battle of machines and minds had begun, though it would take time before its results reached the sea. For now, the struggle remained a test of endurance. The men who fought it aged in months instead of years, their faces lined by wind and fear, their sleep shattered by the memory of explosions. Yet there was beauty even in that darkness, the phosphorescent glow of the explosions of the glow. Sea at night, the quiet moment before dawn, when the horizon turned silver, the laughter that erupted over shared rations in the middle of a storm. These were the things that kept men human when everything around them conspired to make them ghosts. In December 1941, the war widened as America entered the conflict, and the Atlantic grew larger still. New ships, new crews, new hope, but also new dangers. The wolves turned westward, finding fresh hunting grounds along the unguarded coasts of North America. For the Allies, the darkest hours were not over, they were only deepening. The convoy system held, battered but unbroken, a living chain stretched across the sea. Each link strained, each link bled, but none would break. The Battle of the Atlantic had become more than a struggle for survival. It was the very measure of resolve, the proof that nations could endure even when surrounded by despair. And as the cold winds howled over the empty ocean, the men who watched from the bridges of their ships could not yet know that the worst and the turning was still to come. Chapter 5. The Second Happy Time. When the war's tide carried the United States into its depths in December 1941, the Atlantic seemed to tremble with new energy. Yet for a brief and terrible season, that energy belonged not to the Allies, but to the hunters. The U-boats, flushed with success and newly emboldened by Hitler's declaration of war on America, turned westward toward waters they had only dreamed of before. The eastern seaboard of the United States lay exposed, its cities glittering like beacons against the night, its merchant ships sailing in bright lanes as though war were still an ocean away. To Admiral Dönitz, it was an irresistible invitation. And so began what his crews would later call the Zweite Glückliche Zeit, the second happy time. A season of carnage, stretching through the early months of 1942, when the Atlantic off Cape Hatteras and the Gulf Stream became a generation-killing ground. The first U-boats to arrive slipped silently along the coastlines of New York, Virginia, and Florida, their periscopes rising against backdrops of city lights and moonlit beaches. In a single week, ships burned within sight of shore. Hotel guests on the Carolinas dunes could watch tankers explode, their flames mirrored on the waves. It was as if the war had come suddenly to the doorstep of a nation, still unprepared to believe it was real. For the German submariners, it was hunting made effortless. They called it the American shooting season. Torpedoes, fired at silhouettes visible against neon skylines, ships traveling alone without escort, navigation lights glowing foolishly bright. Within the first months of 1942, more than 300 Allied vessels were sunk off the American coast, and each detonation echoed across the ocean, a grim testament to complacency. Yet beneath the triumph there was also unease. The very ease of their victories felt unnatural to seasoned U-boat captains who had once battled across the cold and perilous North Atlantic. They knew this abundance could not last. Still, they obeyed their orders, and night after night the waters blazed. Survivors spoke of oil slicks stretching for miles, of lifeboats adrift among burning seas, of the eerie orange light that turned darkness into dawn. Fishermen found wreckage washing ashore, timbers, crates, and sometimes bodies, and realized the war was no longer distant thunder, but a neighbor pounding on the door. The U-boat bases in France celebrated each success with mounting pride. Crews returned as heroes, their conning towers painted with tallies of sunken tonnage, their eyes hollow from the strain of endless patrols. Radio Berlin trumpeted their exploits as proof that even across the world, German power reached unchallenged. But for every celebration, there was another name added to the growing list of boats overdue. The Atlantic gave, and it took. In America, the shock was profound. The Navy had believed the ocean itself a defense, its vastness a wall against invasion. But now that illusion lay in ruins, shattered by torpedoes that found targets within sight of Manhattan's skyline. Panic and outrage spread through newspapers and harbors alike. Civilians volunteered for coastal watch duties, scanning the horizon for periscopes. At night, the government ordered blackouts along the shore. The bright promenade lights of Atlantic City and Miami went dark, plunging entire coastlines into uneasy shadow. Yet still, the sinkings continued. For months, American shipping persisted in sailing independently, a decision born of arrogance and logistical chaos. The convoy system that had saved Britain had not yet been adopted in full, and the price was catastrophic. It was not until the spring that Admiral Ernest King, under pressure from British advisors, agreed to impose the same discipline along American waters. Slowly, the pattern changed. Merchantmen gathered into escorted groups, destroyers and corvettes, some British, some newly American, forming screens around them. Aircraft patrols increased, and the lights along the coast stayed dark. The easy days of the second happy time began to fade. For the Germans, the turn was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A torpedo that missed, a periscope caught in a searchlight, a patrol aircraft appearing where none had been before. The hunters still struck, but now they bled for every kill. Dönitz sent reinforcements, more boats, more men, hoping to overwhelm the growing defenses, but the vast distances of the American coast stretched his resources thin. Submarines that once prowled in wolf packs were now solitary wanderers, hunted themselves by destroyers equipped with radar and sonar. The Atlantic was changing beneath them, its silence no longer theirs to command. Yet in the memories of those months, the terror lingers. The image of flames blooming over the sea like flowers of fire, the sound of merchant whistles blowing in panic, the sickly sweetness of burning oil carried on the wind. For sailors in those convoys, fear became routine. They learned to sleep in life jackets, to eat with engines idling for instant maneuver, to listen for the telltale hiss of a torpedo's approach. In the mess halls of freighters, conversation often drifted to the same question: how many more crossings could they make before luck ran out? Some prayed, others smoked in silence, counting every hour survived as a small miracle. And yet they sailed again, because the war demanded it. Behind them, shipyards in Baltimore, New Orleans, and Brooklyn worked night and day, launching Liberty ships in assembly line rhythm. Each new hull that slipped into the water carried the hopes of men who had already seen too many sink. The second happy time was ending, but its scars would endure in the widows who watched the horizon, in the wrecks that dotted the seabed, in the understanding that oceans could no longer shield nations. The Germans, too, learned the limits of victory. For each triumphant patrol, the return became more perilous. Allied aircraft began to patrol farther offshore, their engines a constant drone in the night. Radar beams swept across the waves, finding the faint glint of a periscope. Destroyers, once blind, now closed in with uncanny precision, guided by sonar pings that echoed through the depths like heartbeats. The U-boat, once the unseen predator, began to feel the weight of eyes upon it. Captains who had once surfaced boldly to charge batteries now did so with dread, knowing a single mistake could bring annihilation. And yet they continued, driven by duty, by belief, by the unspoken bond that held every crew together. They wrote letters they would never send, carved keepsakes from scrap metal, whispered to the sea as though it could forgive them. The second happy time had been a season of triumph born from another's unpreparedness, and as it faded, both hunter and hunted knew that the true battle was only beginning. The ocean no longer belonged to either side. It belonged to the storm, to the silence, to the ghosts of ships and men alike. By the end of 1942, the American coast was a fortress of convoys and patrols, and the easy victories of winter had become a memory carried by survivors on both sides, a memory of blazing nights and restless waves, of arrogance undone and vigilance reborn. The sea, indifferent as ever, closed over the wreckage and waited for the next chapter of its long, unending war. Chapter 6: The Hunters Become the Hunted. By early 1943, the Atlantic had become a vast graveyard of steel and courage, its waves hiding the bones of ships and the whispered names of men who would never see land again. But beneath the surface of that endless struggle, something fundamental was shifting. The ocean that once belonged to the wolves of Dönitz was beginning to turn against them. For years, the U-boats had ruled by darkness and surprise, slipping like shadows through the convoys, their torpedoes striking unseen, their laughter muffled beneath the sea. Yet the Allies had been learning, adapting, reshaping the war with every loss. And by the spring of 1943, the tide that had once flowed so strongly in Germany's favor began to ebb with quiet, relentless power. The convoys that left Halifax and New York no longer sailed as frightened clusters, praying for daylight. They moved now like armored caravans, bound together by faith and radar. On their flanks steamed destroyers and corvettes whose sonar pings rolled through the water like distant bells. Above them, the sky hummed with patrol aircraft, their eyes scanning every glint of foam for the telltale trace of a periscope. The men aboard those ships no longer felt abandoned to fate. They were part of a living, breathing network of defense ships, planes, and machines linked by radio, mathematics, and resolve. For the first time, the Atlantic itself seemed to side with them. The hunters sensed it first. U-boat captains, who had once surfaced boldly beneath the stars, began to feel the eyes of the world upon them. The darkness, once their ally, had become a trap, pierced by radar beams that turned night into daylight. One commander wrote that he felt naked on the surface, chased by light. When a submarine rose to recharge its batteries, the crew would stare upward, dreading the sudden glare of a lee light sweeping across the waves. The final warning before bombs fell. Depth charges grew deadlier, set to explode in layered patterns that left no escape, and a new weapon called the Hedgehog hurled contact-fused explosives ahead of the ship, a forest of fire descending toward the echo of a hull. For those inside, each ping of sonar was a heartbeat, counting down to silence. Men gripped their bunks, praying as the explosions rolled above them. Bolts tore loose, gauges shattered, water sprayed in arcs across flickering lights. In those moments, courage was measured not by killing, but by enduring. Some boats survived by miracle, others never surfaced again, swallowed whole by pressure and darkness. The hunters were learning the cost of their own trade. Above them, on the convoy escorts, life was no less brutal. The sailors who hunted U-boats lived in a rhythm of exhaustion and fear, sleeping in damp hammocks that swung with every wave, eating meals that tasted of diesel and salt. Their world was a furnace of sound, the whine of engines, the clang of depth-charge racks, the endless sweep of radar antennas. Each sighting, each contact, set off a surge of adrenaline that burned through fatigue. The bridge crews stared into the fog, watching for the flicker of phosphorescence that might betray a periscope. When an explosion echoed far astern, no one knew whether it marked an enemy destroyed or a comrade gone. Yet amid that tension, there grew a strange fraternity, a trust forged in constant peril. They called themselves WW2, the shepherds, and their task was to guard the flock. They spoke little of heroism. They spoke of duty, of keeping the sea lanes open, of getting one more convoy through. Technology, once slow to reach them, now advanced with astonishing speed. Aircraft, such as the B-24 Liberator, could patrol vast stretches of ocean, their range long enough to reach the dreaded mid-Atlantic gap, the black pit that had once been a killing ground beyond the reach of land-based planes. With each new patrol, the wolves found fewer places to hide. Allied factories worked around the clock, pouring out sonar sets, radar screens, and radio direction finders that could home in on a U-boat's brief transmission. At Bletchley Park, mathematicians and linguists broke the German naval Enigma code, reading Donitz's orders almost as soon as he sent them. What had been invisible was becoming transparent. What had been chance was turning into science. Every improvement in detection, every refinement of tactics, was a quiet act of vengeance for the ships already lost. The balance of fear had shifted. By March 1943, the great convoy battles of the Atlantic reached their climax. In the freezing gales north of the Azores, convoys SC-122 and HX-229 fought desperate running fights against more than 40 U-boats. For days, the sea was alive with explosions, tracer fire, and flares. Merchant ships burned through the night, their cargoes of oil turning the water into liquid fire, while escorts zigzagged through smoke and wreckage, dropping depth charges until their racks were empty. The U-boats struck hard, sinking 22 ships, but the cost was rising beyond reason. Destroyers rammed submarines, aircraft pounced from the clouds, and sonar men tracked the faint echoes of retreating hulls until they faded forever. The ocean itself seemed to have turned against its former predators. For every ship lost, another U-boat was dragged down into the abyss. In May, the month sailors would remember as Black May. 41 German submarines were destroyed, the highest toll of the entire war. It was the moment the hunters became the hunted. The impact rippled through every base on the French Atlantic coast. In Lorient, Brest, and Street-Nazaire, the pens that had once rung with triumph fell silent. Crews preparing for new patrols did so with grim faces. They no longer spoke of victory, only of survival. Letters from the front carried a note of dread, commanders admitting they had lost more men than they could replace. Mechanics working by candlelight as bombs rained from Allied aircraft above. Admiral Donitz read the casualty lists in disbelief. His gray wolves, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, were being annihilated faster than they could be built. Yet he refused to yield. He spoke to his men of sacrifice, of endurance, of a new generation of U-boats that would turn the tide again. But even he knew the arithmetic had turned fatal. The Allies were building ships faster than Germany could sink them. For every merchantman lost, 3 new Liberty ships slid down the slips of American shipyards, their gray hulls gleaming like rebirth. The Atlantic was being filled not with despair but with steel. Still, the struggle did not end overnight. Every convoy that sailed from Halifax or Liverpool carried within it the potential for disaster. The U-boats that remained at sea were desperate, ferocious, and cunning. Some attacked on the surface, guns blazing in defiance. Others crept below the thermocline, silent and waiting. The Allied escorts knew that even a dying enemy was deadly. They fought with a discipline born of respect as much as hatred. When a submarine was forced to the surface and surrendered, sailors would sometimes watch in silence as its crew leapt into the water, unwilling to abandon the ship to capture. It was said that the ocean accepted all men, equally German, British, Canadian, American, and in that vast equality, there was a kind of Mondaie, grim mercy. For the merchant sailors, the change was subtle but profound. They still sailed through storms, still watched friends vanish into the sea. But the fear that had once lived in their bones began to fade. Convoys that reached Britain arrived more often intact, their holds filled with food, fuel, and hope. The docks of Liverpool and Glasgow thundered with the sound of unloading cranes. For the first time in years, ration lines shortened, and the British people began to believe they might outlast the siege. In letters home, sailors wrote of seeing the Irish coast rise from the fog, of the joy that came with hearing gulls after weeks of emptiness. They spoke of comrades lost, but also of comrades saved, of ships that made it through. The sea, though still cruel, no longer felt invincible. By summer 1943, the transformation was complete. Hunter-killer groups built around small escort carriers prowled the ocean, seeking out the last U-boats like lions driving prey from the plains. Their aircraft, Wildcats and Avengers, roared over the waves, dropping depth charges with deadly precision. The submarines that had once haunted the convoy lanes now fled from them. Some limped back to base, damaged and leaking. Others vanished without a trace. The war beneath the waves had become a war of attrition the Germans could not win. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest campaign of the Second World War, had reached its turning point not through a single great victory, but through 1,000 small acts of courage. A sonar operator refusing to blink through exhaustion, a pilot spotting a faint wake in gray seas, a signalman decoding a message in the nick of time. Each moment chipped away at the U-boat menace until, by the end of the year, the convoys sailed with a confidence that would have been unthinkable before. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Atlantic, cold, merciless, eternal, had borne witness to both triumph and tragedy. The sea kept its secrets, holding, within its depths, the wrecks of merchantmen and submarines alike, their bones entwined in the same silence. But for those who survived, there remained one certainty, that in the endless contest between destruction and endurance, it was endurance that prevailed. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won in a day, or even in a year. It was won by persistence, the persistence of men who refused to yield, of nations that refused to starve, of ships that kept sailing into the gray horizon. The ocean still whispered at night, remembering the hunters and the hunted, but above its waves flew the quiet flag of survival, and beneath it slept the ghosts who had made that survival possible. Chapter 7. The Black Pit. They called it the Black Pit, that vast, yawning stretch of the mid-Atlantic where no aircraft could reach and no help could come, a shadowed chasm of sea and sky that seemed to swallow sound, light, and hope itself. For years, it was the graveyard of convoys, the space where the balance between life and death tilted most cruelly toward the latter, and every sailor who crossed it felt its pull, the weight of the unknown pressing down upon him. The Black Pit stretched like a scar across the ocean, beyond the range of land-based aircraft from Newfoundland or Northern Ireland, a gap that neither radar nor radio could bridge. Once a convoy entered, it was alone. There were no rescuers, no watchful eyes from above, only the rolling gray of the sea and the echo of engines beating against the wind. For the men aboard merchant ships, it was a place of silence and dread, a test of endurance and faith. They spoke of it in whispers before departure, glancing at charts where the air gap yawned wide like the mouth of fate. Crossing it meant trusting to discipline, to escort ships, and to the fragile hope that the U-boats had not already scented them. For Admiral Donitz and his wolves, the Black Pit was paradise. Here, no planes hunted them, no radar pierced their stealth, and the convoys that entered this stretch were like herds wandering blind. The U-boats waited in wolf packs, spread out in long patrol lines across the sea, their hydrophones straining to catch the rhythmic pulse of propellers. Once contact was made, the word went out, short coded messages flashing across the ether, drawing other submarines like vultures to carrion. The ocean itself became an ambush. Night fell, and from beneath the waves, periscopes broke the surface like the eyes of predators. In the distance, faint lights glimmered through the fog. The convoys, steaming westward at 8 knots, oblivious to what gathered around them. Then came the first attack, torpedoes slicing through black water, the muffled thump of explosions, the orange bloom of flames rising against the horizon. Panic spread like wildfire as ships veered wildly, trying to evade unseen hunters. The escorts turned outward, racing towards sonar contacts, their depth charges churning the sea into chaos. But for every submarine they forced down, another rose elsewhere. The battle was not a clash of fleets, but a deadly dance in the dark, unseen, and unending. One of the most harrowing of these crossings came in February 1943, with convoy SC-118. 63 merchant ships set out from Nova Scotia, laden with food, ammunition, and fuel bound for Britain's survival. They were escorted by a handful of destroyers and corvettes, brave men, but few in number. The convoy entered the Black Pit under heavy weather, the kind that seemed almost merciful, for storms often scattered U-boats. But the wolves were waiting. For 6 days they harried the formation, diving and surfacing, attacking at night and fading into the storm by dawn. 11 ships went down in those frozen waters, their crews struggling in lifeboats that capsized or vanished in the cold. Survivors spoke later of the sea itself catching fire, oil slicks burning for miles, their glow reflected in the eyes of men who knew they would never see morning. Yet even as the losses mounted, the escorts refused to yield. They counterattacked with every weapon they had, depth charges hammering the depths until the water itself seemed to tremble. The Germans sank their prey but bled in return. Several submarines never reported back. By the time the survivors sighted land, their decks were coated in ice and their faces hollow with exhaustion. But they had made it, and that endurance, not victory, but survival, was its own kind of triumph. The men who sailed those convoys learned to live with constant tension. They could not see their enemies, only imagine them. Each day was measured by the beat of engines and the endless sweep of the horizon. Sleep was rare, food often cold, conversation brief. Even in calm weather they felt watched. The creak of hulls or a distant thud could send hearts racing. They came to know the sea as something alive, a presence that could cradle or kill. And when torpedoes struck, it was always without warning. A sudden blast, a blinding flash, the world tilting sideways as steel tore apart. Men were thrown into the freezing water, oil filling their lungs, the screams of comrades drowned by the roar of fire. Those who survived long enough to reach rafts faced hours or days of torment, frostbite, thirst, hallucinations born of exposure. Some clung to wreckage until rescue arrived, others simply slipped beneath the surface. For them, the Black Pit became not just a place but a destiny. Yet the Allied escorts, those weary shepherds of the sea, refused to surrender the Black Pit. They fought with a tenacity that bordered on madness. Their ships, small and often underarmed, charged into the night at sonar contacts, risking torpedoes to save the convoy. They lived in perpetual dampness boots, rotting, uniforms soaked with salt, their skin chafed raw by wind and spray. But their determination hardened into something indestructible. They were ordinary men doing an extraordinary job. Canadian, British, American, Norwegian, united by the shared conviction that the sea could not be allowed to win. They learned to think like their enemies, to anticipate patterns, to hear the faint tremor that distinguished a submarine's propellers from the heartbeat of the ocean. When they scored a kill, the satisfaction was brief. When they failed, the guilt lasted forever. Many captains wrote afterward that what haunted them most were not the battles, but the silences, the long nights when nothing happened, when they knew the enemy was near but invisible, waiting, listening. By spring 1943, the Black Pit became the crucible of the entire Atlantic campaign. It was here, in the heart of the void, that both sides tested not only their weapons but their endurance. Convoys like ONS-5, a westbound fleet of 43 merchant ships, endured week-long attacks from 40 German submarines. The sea was a maelstrom of destruction, ships burning, submarines crushed beneath the waves. The convoy lost 13 vessels, but the escorts struck back with new ferocity. 7 U-boats were destroyed, their wrecks sinking into the abyss. It was a symbolic battle, the moment when the balance began to tilt for good. For every ship the Germans sank, they lost a submarine, and the arithmetic of war turned inexorably against them. The Black Pit, once their sanctuary, had become their grave. Technology closed the gap. Long-range aircraft, flying from Newfoundland, Iceland, and the Azores, extended their patrols farther each month. Their shadows began to appear even over the deepest part of the ocean. Liberators carrying radar and depth charges transformed the unguarded void into a killing field for the hunters. Convoys now sailed beneath invisible wings. The U-boats, starved of safety, could no longer surface freely to recharge or communicate. Even a periscope wake could bring death from above. The men aboard those submarines began to dread the sky as much as the sea. What had once been their kingdom was shrinking daily, squeezed by technology, strategy, and sheer Allied willpower. For the men of both sides, the Black Pit was more than a place. It was an ordeal that etched itself into the soul. The convoys that crossed it carried not just cargo, but the very lifeblood of nations. Every ton of grain, every barrel of oil, every crate of ammunition meant that Britain could endure, that the factories would keep turning, that the lights of civilization would not go dark. Each sailor knew it, and that knowledge gave their suffering meaning. They endured the storms, the fear, and the endless uncertainty because they understood what was at stake. When the last of the great wolf packs withdrew from the mid-Atlantic in May 1943, the silence that followed was almost sacred. The sea, which had devoured so much, lay calm again, as if exhausted by the toll it had taken. In the years that followed, sailors who survived would speak of the Black Pit with reverence and pain. Some could never cross an ocean again. Others returned to it, unable to live without its rhythm. They had seen what few men ever see, the full measure of human endurance tested against the most unforgiving element on earth. They had seen courage that defied reason, fear that became habit, and hope that refused to die. The Black Pit was the heart of the Battle of the Atlantic, and through it, the Allies learned the ultimate truth of that war, that survival was victory and persistence, the greatest weapon of all. Chapter 8: The Turning Tide. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic had changed its face. The long, terrible years when the wolves roamed freely beneath the waves were ending, and though the sea still demanded lives, it no longer belonged to the hunters. The turning tide had come slowly, without fanfare or single moment of triumph, but through a steady, relentless tightening of the noose, one improvement, one adaptation, one act of endurance at a time. The men who fought it scarcely noticed the change. As it happened, it came in whispers rather than shouts. The convoys began to arrive more often intact, their losses shrinking from dozens to mere handfuls. The sailors who once whispered prayers with every sunrise began to speak of survival as something more than luck. The escort ships that had once dashed from one emergency to the next now moved with measured confidence, their radar screens alive with information, their captains guided by intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. What no one at sea yet fully grasped was that the invisible war, the War of Minds, had already been won in secret rooms, far from the ocean. In the quiet corridors of Bletchley Park, the cryptanalysts who had toiled in secrecy for years had finally broken the heart of the German naval enigma. Each intercepted message, once unreadable, now laid bare the intentions of the U-boat fleet. Convoys could be rerouted away from danger before the danger even arrived. The wolves were being outmaneuvered before they had even scented the prey. For the first time since the war began, the hunters found themselves lost in their own ocean. The transformation was not just technological, it was human. Experience, hard-earned and written in the logbooks of the dead, had turned the Allied escort commanders into masters of the underwater war. They no longer chased echoes blindly. They listened, they anticipated, they understood the rhythm of their enemies. Depth charges fell not in guesswork but in choreography, their explosions forming deadly nets around trapped submarines. The Hedgehog mortars, hurling their pattern of contact bombs, proved devastating. For the submariners who had once slipped away into safety, survival was now a matter of luck and seconds. One wrong decision, a slow dive, a burst of engine noise, a faulty valve was fatal. The U-boats began to fear the surface, but they also feared the depths. Even the sea itself seemed to betray them. Every sound amplified, every vibration hunted. Men who had once boasted of sinking dozens of ships now prayed simply to return home. Some captains, rather than surrender, chose to dive beyond crush depth, their boats imploding silently under tons of pressure. Others surfaced to surrender, stepping out into blinding daylight, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty of victory. Above them, the Allied escort carriers, small, slow, but packed with fury, patrolled the ocean lanes like watchful giants. From their decks roared Avengers and Wildcats, aircraft that could turn an expanse of water into a trap within minutes. Pilots scoured the horizon, their eyes trained to spot even the faintest ripple or oil slick. When radar found a contact, they dove with deadly precision, depth charges cascading into the sea. Many submarines were destroyed without ever firing a shot. The hunter-killer groups that sailed with these carriers, commanded by men like Captain Johnny Walker of the Royal Navy, developed new tactics, aggressive, relentless, merciless. They no longer waited for the U-boats to strike. They went after them. For weeks, they hunted in coordinated sweeps, following radio trails, sonar echoes, and even the migration of whale pods that sometimes revealed hidden submarines. Walker's men became legends, their destroyers, symbols of vengeance for every ship lost in the earlier years. They played the ocean like an instrument, listening to its music and turning its silence into a weapon. In the harbors of occupied France, Dönitz watched the toll mount. His U-boat arm, once the pride of the Reich, was now bleeding out before his eyes. Each month brought reports of new losses, boats that never returned, crews listed as missing, bases bombed by Allied aircraft. He had built fortresses of concrete at Lorient, Brest, and Street. Nazaire. Immense bunkers that seemed impervious to attack, yet even these sanctuaries could not shield his men from despair. The young sailors who once volunteered with eagerness now went aboard with fear in their eyes. The veterans were gone, killed, captured, or too haunted to continue. Dönitz, a man of cold calculation, still believed in victory through willpower, but the numbers betrayed him. In May 1943 alone, 41 submarines were destroyed. That month, the wolf packs withdrew from the North Atlantic, retreating like wounded beasts to lick their wounds. It was the first true admission of defeat. For the Allied sailors, the shift was palpable. Convoys that had once felt doomed now carried an air of defiance. The men began to laugh again, to sing as they worked, to believe that perhaps the sea had finally chosen their side. In the mess halls, they spoke of the airmen who patrolled overhead, of the new long-range liberators that could chase submarines even across the once untouchable Black Pit. The pilots, too, had stories of seeing U-boats erupt from beneath the waves, of survivors clinging to rafts as the sea turned black with oil. There was pity among the triumph. The enemy was no longer an unseen monster, but men, young, frightened, and just as human. Many sailors, even as they celebrated survival, could not shake the knowledge that their enemies drowned the same way they would have, choking, cold, and alone. In this vast ocean, victory was a solemn thing. In the quiet hours of night watches, men stared at the dark horizon and thought about what it had cost to reach this turning tide. Over 30,000 Allied sailors had already been lost, and more than 2,000 ships sent to the bottom. Entire convoys had vanished without a trace, their only memorials, the oil slicks drifting on the waves. Even now, every crossing carried risk. Mines still floated loose, Luftwaffe aircraft still prowled, and lone U-boats, desperate and vengeful, still struck from the depths. But something had changed in the hearts of those who fought. The fear that once ruled them had been replaced by endurance, and endurance by quiet confidence. They had learned that the ocean could not be conquered, only survived. And they had survived long enough to see the tide shift. Technology alone did not win the Atlantic, it was faith. Faith in comrades who would not abandon you. Faith in the ship beneath your feet. Faith that every frozen hour spent on watch, every friend buried at sea, every depth charge dropped into the void, mattered. That faith had carried them through storms and silence alike, through the unbearable and the unthinkable. When a convoy arrived safely in Liverpool or Glasgow, the dockyards would erupt in cheers, cranes swinging into motion as families wept on the quayside. Each arrival was more than a victory. It was a lifeline renewed. Children ate because those convoys made it through. Cities kept their lights because those ships delivered fuel. Soldiers fought on other fronts because the Atlantic was held. The men who sailed it seldom thought of themselves as heroes, but without them, no other battle could have been won. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic War was no longer a battle for survival but a struggle to finish what had been begun. The Allies had taken the offensive. Hunter-killer groups now swept the ocean from horizon to horizon, seeking out the remnants of the U-boat fleet. New bases in Iceland, Newfoundland, and the Azores closed the last gaps in air coverage. The ocean that had once hidden the enemy now exposed him. The German Navy, once so proud, was now fighting ghosts, an enemy it could not outsmart, outbuild, or outlast. The turning tide had become a flood. And yet, for all the statistics and triumphs, for all the maps marked with sinking positions and convoy routes, the story of the Atlantic remained deeply human. It was the story of the lookouts who froze on the bridge, scanning for periscopes, the engineers who slept beside roaring boilers, the pilots who searched until their fuel ran dry, and the signalmen who listened for faint Morse code from the dying. It was a story written in salt and sweat and silence, in the cries of the rescued and the prayers of the lost. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun as a struggle for ships, but had become a struggle for souls, a test of endurance, sacrifice, and the unyielding will to live. When the tide turned in 1943, it did not roar like a victory. It sighed, quiet and tired, across the waves. The sea seemed to pause, as though recognizing that something immense had passed. The men who had fought its wrath would never forget it. They had seen the Atlantic in all its moods, cruel, beautiful, eternal, and they knew that no triumph could ever tame it. The hunters were gone, the convoys sailed freer, and yet, somewhere beneath the calm, the ocean still whispered of the wolves that once ruled its depths. Chapter 9. The Sky Above the Sea. By late 1943, the Atlantic was no longer the same endless, undefended graveyard it had once been. It had become a hunted place, a battlefield watched from above as much as patrolled from below. The sky, once vast and empty over the convoys, now buzzed with engines, the sound of aircraft that bridged the gap between continents and turned the tide of a war that had nearly drowned in darkness. For years, the mid-Atlantic had been a black pit, the stretch of ocean too distant for land-based aircraft to reach, where convoys vanished without warning and where wolf packs fed freely in the night. But now that void had been closed. Long-range liberators from Coastal Command, flying fortresses adapted for sea patrols, and carrier-borne Avengers filled the skies, their radar and spotlights probing the mist and rain for the faintest sign of a periscope's wake. To the sailors below, their presence was a miracle, the long-missing guardian angels of the Atlantic. To the submariners beneath, they were a new terror, engines of fate that could strike from nowhere, piercing even the storm, with eyes that saw through darkness. The balance had shifted utterly, and the U-boat men, once the hunters, now became the hunted. It was no longer enough for a submarine to find a convoy. It had to survive long enough to escape. Every dawn brought new tension. The surface, which had once offered safety for recharging batteries, had become a death sentence. The moment a U-boat rose to breathe, to drink in air through its snorkel, or to signal headquarters, a liberator might appear over the horizon, descending like judgment. Pilots flew for hours over empty waves, scanning for tiny ripples or the shimmer of oil on water that betrayed a submarine's presence. When they found one, there was no hesitation. Depth charges fell in precise patterns, the sea erupted in columns of foam, and the once invisible hunter vanished into the depths. For the U-boat crews, there was no defense against the sky. Anti-aircraft guns rattled uselessly as the planes swooped, their machine guns stitching the sea. Men scrambled through flooded compartments, shouting in the dark as explosions crushed steel. Some submarines sank silently, their hulls imploding like tin cans under the pressure. Others surfaced crippled, their crews spilling into lifeboats, waiting to be plucked from the water by the very men they had tried to destroy. The war had grown intimate and tragic, its cruelty matched only by its strange, shared humanity. Many Allied airmen, circling the wreckage after an attack, dropped rafts or supplies to the survivors below, unable to hate the faces staring back at them from the sea. Above all, it was technology that had turned the tide in this sky-sea alliance. Radar, once primitive, now scanned the waves with a precision that made hiding almost impossible. The invention of centimetric radar, using shorter wavelengths that even the Germans' detectors could not sense, gave the Allies an unseen advantage. At night, aircraft flew with radar-guided lee lights, sudden beams that pierced the blackness and froze a day U-boat in their glare, caught between heaven and hell. Pilots described the shock of those moments. 1 second, nothing but dark waves. The next, a silver conning tower glinting in the beam, startled men running for the deck guns, and then the eruption of explosions as the ocean swallowed them whole. Even storms offered no safety, for the new technology saw through cloud and rain alike. The hunters were blind no longer, and for the men beneath the waves, nowhere was truly safe. The Allied command had also learned to think like the enemy, and Intelligence Ultra guided them with eerie foresight. Every intercepted message, every coordinate decrypted at Bletchley Park, painted a picture of the enemy's movements. Convoys no longer stumbled blindly into traps, they sailed around them, guided by unseen hands that knew where the wolves would strike. Entire wolf packs were ambushed by hunter-killer groups that seemed to appear from nowhere, their depth charges falling with uncanny timing. Donitz raged in his command bunker, convinced there must be spies in his ranks. He replaced codes, shifted frequencies, and issued orders with growing desperation, but nothing changed. His carefully planned ambushes dissolved before they began, his captains cut off mid-patrol, his fleet dying not by gunfire alone but by invisible hands of mathematics and logic. He had once believed in the infallibility of Enigma, now it betrayed him with every signal sent. The ocean that had once obeyed his will had turned against him. For the Allies, the sea war was no longer merely defensive, it became an offensive, systematic extermination of the U-boat menace. Escort carriers steamed ahead of convoys to flush out enemies before they could attack. Destroyers formed hunter-killer groups, coordinated through radio and radar, sweeping vast sectors of the ocean. Aircraft from bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and the Azores extended their reach, sealing off the last of the Atlantic's hiding places. The German fleet dwindled not only through destruction, but despair. New recruits, barely trained, went out on patrols that had become suicide missions. Many never reached their first kill. The ocean swallowed them before they could even fire a torpedo. Allied sailors began to notice the change. The fear that had haunted them for years, the dread of invisible predators, faded into pity. The gray wolves of the Atlantic had grown thin, their howls fading into silence. And yet, the victory was not without cost. The men who fought this battle, sailors, pilots, engineers, and signalmen, carried scars that could not be seen. The strain of endless vigilance, the exhaustion of night watches, the grief for friends lost to the deep, all weighed heavily upon them. Many who survived would never forget the sound of the sea when a torpedo struck, or the sight of burning oil stretching across the waves. They dreamed of the faces of comrades who had gone down with their ships, or of the enemies they had watched die through binoculars. Some felt pride, others only guilt. For all its triumphs, the Atlantic remained a graveyard. Beneath those cold waters lay over 70,000 souls, sailors from every nation, friend and foe alike, resting together in silence. The ocean, in the end, had claimed them all, without judgment. By early 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was no longer in doubt. The U-boats still sailed, but they no longer shaped the war. They were relics of an earlier phase, shadows of a weapon that had once terrified the world. The convoys now crossed in peace more often than in panic. The great invasion of Europe, D-Day, could be prepared without fear of starvation. The ships that carried tanks, fuel, and men to Normandy sailed upon an ocean that was, for the first time in 5 years, under Allied control. In Churchill's words, the Atlantic had been the dominating factor of the war. Its victory was not one of glory, but of endurance, of science, cooperation, and the quiet, unyielding strength of those who refused to let the sea defeat them. For every ship that arrived in port, for every sailor who stepped ashore, the battle's meaning was simple. They had endured, and by enduring, they had won. The airmen who had once feared running out of fuel now flew victory patrols, their eyes tracing calm waters where once the enemy had prowled. The radar screens that had once glowed with danger now showed peace. The last wolf packs retreated to the coasts of Norway and France, hiding in harbors that would soon fall to the advancing Allies. In those final months, the U-boat war collapsed, not with an explosion, but with a whimper. Crews scuttled their boats rather than surrender, and Dönitz himself, now Führer, for a brief, bitter moment after Hitler's death, ordered the remnants of his fleet to cease fire. The hunters, who had once defied the world, went down into the sea one last time, not as conquerors, but as ghosts. And when the news spread across the Allied fleets that the Atlantic was finally free, there was no celebration, no outburst of triumph. Only a quiet exhale, a deep sigh that seemed to ripple through the ocean itself. Men leaned on railings, staring into the gray horizon, feeling something they could not name. Relief, perhaps, or grief, or the knowledge that the sea, though pacified, would never be truly tamed. They had fought it and survived, but they knew it was not theirs to own. It belonged to no one. The Battle of the Atlantic was over, but the ocean endured, eternal, unbroken, and vast, carrying within its depths the memory of all who had fought upon it. Chapter 10: The Wolves in Retreat. By the spring of 1944, the wolves that had once prowled the Atlantic in proud defiance were now limping ghosts, scattered across a sea that no longer belonged to them. Their conning towers, once symbols of terror, rose less often through the waves, and when they did, it was only for moments to breathe, to listen, to remember what it had felt like to be free. The sea had turned against them. What had once been their hunting ground was now a gauntlet of radar, sonar, and aircraft. Every mile sailed carried the weight of fear. Every dive brought the pressure of both the ocean and inevitability. The men aboard these submarines knew they were fighting a war already lost, but duty or perhaps resignation bound them to their posts. They no longer sailed to win, they sailed to endure. The once proud U-boat arm of Germany, that iron pack of grey wolves that had nearly starved Britain into surrender, was bleeding itself to death beneath the waves. In Donitz's headquarters, the situation was grimly understood, but never spoken aloud. To admit defeat was to shatter the illusion that had sustained them since 1939, that courage and cunning could overcome the industrial might of the world. But the illusion was cracking, and the sea, which had once whispered promises of glory, now murmured only of loss. Each patrol that left the bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest carried fewer men who believed they would return. The sailors still stood on deck as they departed, waving to families they would never see again, but their smiles were thin, their eyes hollow. They had seen too many empty berths, too many flags folded and returned to grieving mothers. The ports themselves had become cities of ghosts, filled with widows in black who walked the same paths to the harbor, waiting for boats that would never return. Yet the orders came, and the boats sailed, their steel hulls cutting through fog and fear. Dönitz still believed in his mission to strike one more blow, to sink one more ship, to prove that the Wolfpack spirit had not died. But even he, the master of the deep, could feel the weight of the ocean turning cold against him. His crews wrote letters that spoke not of victory, but of weariness, of cramped compartments filled with classly, the stench of oil and sweat, of sleepless nights, haunted by sonar pings that grew closer and closer until they became the drumbeat of death. The U-boat war that had once been a dance of shadows had become a nightmare of survival. Allied hunter-killer groups prowled with relentless efficiency, guided by ultra-intelligence that stripped the submarines of their secrecy. The air, once a safe barrier between the surface and the sky, now teemed with danger. From the Bay of Biscay to the Norwegian fjords, aircraft watched day and night, swooping low over the waves, dropping depth charges with deadly precision. Even before leaving port, many submarines were attacked, caught in the shallow approaches by bombers that rained destruction on their bases. The men joked darkly that they were dying before they had even begun to fight. The reality was harsher than any jest. The Atlantic had become an open wound, swallowing men faster than Germany could train them. The U-boat fleet, once the spearhead of Hitler's naval ambitions, was now a graveyard in motion. Every patrol was a gamble with odds that no longer made sense. For every merchant ship sunk, 2 or 3 submarines were lost, their crews entombed in steel coffins somewhere in the cold, indifferent deep. Inside the submarines, life had narrowed to the pulse of machinery and the rhythm of fear. The air was stale, heavy with exhaust fumes and sweat, and the walls dripped with condensation. The constant hum of the engines filled every silence. Men moved through the narrow corridors like shadows, speaking in whispers, their faces pale beneath the dim red lights that never fully banished the dark. Sleep came in fragments, broken by alarms or the sudden lurch of a dive. Meals were meager tinned food, hard bread, coffee so thick it tasted of metal, and water was rationed, leaving salt crusted on their lips. Yet even in this claustrophobic hell, there were moments of grim humanity. A song hummed softly in the dark, a letter read aloud from home, a brief laugh when a torpedo finally struck true. These fragments of normalcy, small and fragile, were all that kept despair at bay. For many, faith became a lifeline, prayers whispered not for victory, but for mercy, for an end to the endless, suffocating silence. Above them, the world was changing. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Europe, their convoys now sailing with confidence through seas once feared. Escort carriers shadowed every formation, their aircraft swooping in wide arcs of protection. The air patrols from Iceland and Newfoundland met in the middle of the Atlantic, closing the last of the deadly gaps that had once been the wolves' paradise. The ocean was no longer divided. It was unified under the watchful eyes of men who had learned through bitter loss how to master it. The convoy routes had become highways of war, carrying tanks, guns, food, and soldiers to Britain. Each ship that crossed now did so on the shoulders of those who had died to make it safe. In this way, the dead still fought, their memory shaping the living's determination. For the U-boat men, the war's meaning had inverted. Once they had sailed as predators, confident in their power, now they crept like prey, hunted by machines that seemed to see and hear everything. They lived by reflex, by instinct, by the faint hope that luck might favor them one more time. When a sonar ping echoed through the hull, hearts froze. When the depth charges began to fall, the world became an inferno of noise and pressure, steel groaning like a wounded animal, lights flickering as bolts tore loose. Men clutched at one another, not from fear of death that was familiar, but from the primal terror of drowning unseen in the blackness below. When the explosions faded and the silence returned, some wept quietly, their nerves shredded beyond repair. Others simply stared, hollow-eyed, waiting for the next attack. They were ghosts before they died, their courage unbroken, but their hope extinguished. And yet, amid the collapse, there were moments of stubborn bravery that defied the odds. A U-boat, damaged and hunted, still managed to strike a convoy, sending a freighter blazing into the night. Another surfaced under fire to rescue survivors from a sinking ship. Enemy sailors pulled aboard by men who shared the same fear, the same exhaustion. These acts, rare and often forgotten, revealed the last flicker of humanity in a war that had lost nearly all of it. The men who fought beneath the waves were not demons, nor heroes, but mortals trapped in the machinery of fate. They did not fight for ideology. By the end they fought because they were there, because turning back was no longer possible. By the summer of 1944, even Dönitz could no longer deny the truth. The Atlantic had been lost. His reports to Hitler grew shorter, more cautious. He spoke of temporary setbacks, of new weapons under development, of the snorkel that would allow submarines to remain unseen. But these were hollow hopes. The snorkel was flawed, and the new electro-boats were still only dreams on the drafting table. What mattered was the sea, and the sea no longer answered to him. The Allied convoys arrived with near-perfect regularity, their losses minimal, their morale unshakable. Britain, once on the edge of starvation, was overflowing with supplies. American industry, unbroken and unstoppable, poured ships into the ocean faster than any U-boat could sink them. The tide that had turned in 1943 was now a flood, washing away the remnants of Germany's naval might. And still, the submarines went out. Still, men climbed down into those narrow hulls, sealing themselves away from the world above. Still, they sailed into the darkness, because to refuse was to betray everything they had already endured. Each voyage was both defiance and surrender, defiance against a world that had outgrown them, and surrender to the destiny they could no longer escape. They were the last wolves of a dying pack, howling into a storm that had forgotten their names. And as they vanished beneath the waves, they carried with them the echoes of an age of courage, of tragedy, of the cruel beauty of men who fought an endless battle against the sea itself. Chapter 11. Black May. By May 1943, the ocean itself seemed to turn against the hunters. What had once been a vast blue kingdom for Germany's U-boats became a pit of iron and fire, a place where the very water rebelled against them. They had ruled it for 4 long years, slipping unseen between convoys, firing torpedoes in silence, and vanishing into the dark. But that spring, the balance cracked, and the tide of history poured through the fracture. Allied escorts now moved with a precision born of blood-learned skill. Sonar pings no longer wandered uncertainly through the depths, but locked upon their echoes like heartbeat to heartbeat. Aircraft circled overhead from dawn to dusk, their engines a constant growl that pressed into the skulls of exhausted submariners. When night came, the sky no longer offered cover, but menace lee lights burst from the clouds, white as judgment, freezing the steel backs of U-boats before the bombs fell. Every surfacing was a gamble with death. Every message to headquarters, a signal that might be intercepted. The hunters had become prey, and the prey had learned to hunt in packs of its own. In that month, the Atlantic changed forever. The convoys, once ragged lines of victims, now steamed as armored caravans guarded by destroyers, corvettes, and escort carriers that knit the sea and the sky together in one deadly web. To the sailors aboard them, the difference was felt not only in safety but in spirit. They no longer whispered prayers of survival, they began to believe in victory. The gray wolves of Dönitz's fleet, meanwhile, bled in silence. In those few weeks, 41 U-boats were lost, more than at any time in Potter's. The entire war. Each one taking 40 or 50 men with it into the cold. There were no funerals, only oil slicks and bubbles. No graves but the seabed itself. In the pens of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, the commanders stood on the docks and counted who did not return. The gaps in the rows of crewmen spoke louder than reports. Mothers back in Germany received telegrams that said, missing, presumed drowned, and no more. The legend of the invincible submariner died that month beneath the waves. For the Allies, Black May was not simply a statistic. It was vindication after years of terror and starvation. It was the proof that endurance could outlast fear, that technology, discipline, and cooperation could break the grip of any enemy. Every sailor on escort duty felt it in his bones, the shift from reaction to control. Where once they had waited helplessly for the first explosion, they now struck first, sweeping the dark for periscopes and shadows, chasing contacts for hours until the sea itself erupted. The new Hedgehog mortars spat patterns of explosives that detonated only when they touched steel. The sound of a single blast confirmed a kill and sent cheers echoing across the decks. Pilots returning from patrol brought back photographs of oil and debris where submarines had once prowled. In London, Washington, and Ottawa, the admiralties watched the graphs of sinkings and losses cross each other like intersecting destinies, merchant ships rising, U-boats falling, and they knew the long nightmare was ending. Yet even in triumph, the mood was somber. The men who manned those escorts had seen too much to celebrate. They remembered the years when the sea burned at night, when friends vanished without trace, when every convoy number meant another roll of the dice with death. Victory, when it came, felt heavy, as if purchased too dearly. The Atlantic had consumed thousands before yielding its lesson. On the German side, disbelief gave way to despair. Dönitz, who had once commanded the ocean from his map room, like a conductor of storms, now faced reports so grim they defied even his iron faith. Each morning brought another list of boats overdue, another signal that faded into silence. His captain spoke of a sea alive with enemies, of radar that pierced the fog, of aircraft that struck out of nowhere. The men still went to sea because they were ordered to, but they no longer believed the ocean belonged to them. They wrote letters filled with fatal calm. "If we do not return, remember us kindly," and sealed them knowing the ink might never dry in the hands of the living. The U-boat pens that once rang with confidence now echoed with the hollow clang of maintenance crews repairing vessels that would never sail again. In the taverns nearby, the laughter of shore leave had turned to whispers. Too many uniforms had empty sleeves. Too many girls waited by the harbor railings for shadows that never appeared on the horizon. In Berlin, propaganda still spoke of triumphs in the Atlantic, but the sailors knew better. They had seen the truth written in oil and fire. The transformation was total and irreversible. The Allies had forged from desperation a machine that merged man and technology in perfect rhythm. Radar, sonar, intelligence, air cover, and convoy discipline formed a living network that covered the Atlantic like a heartbeat. No longer could a wolf pack strike unseen. Each radio transmission betrayed its lair, each surfacing drew eyes from the sky. The once formidable Type 7 and IX boats had become relics, too slow to dive, too fragile to withstand depth-charge barrages that shook them apart from keel to conning tower. In Germany, new designs were whispered about the electro-boot, the snorkel, the acoustic torpedo, but they existed only in blueprints, promises to comfort the dying. The reality was that the war had outrun them. In shipyards across America, Liberty ships slid down the ways faster than submarines could sink them, an industrial rhythm that no tactic could match. The sea, once an equalizer, had been conquered by scale. Yet Black May was more than machinery, it was the moment the moral tide turned. The U-boat crews who had once felt like knights of the deep began to see themselves as condemned men, fighting not for victory but for survival. They still fought bravely. Courage does not vanish, even when hope does. But the pride that had filled them in the early happy times was gone. They surfaced less often, spoke less to each other, moved through their narrow hulls like ghosts rehearsing their own eulogies. Some still struck lucky, sinking a straggler here, an escort there, but even these successes felt hollow. Each torpedo fired meant more attention from the sky, more vengeance from destroyers whose captains no longer feared them. They were trapped in a paradox of their own legend, feared long after they had lost the power to inspire fear. When the figures were tallied at the end of that month, Dönitz faced the inevitable. 41 boats lost, hundreds of men gone, and no strategic gain to show. He gathered his staff in silence. The maps spread before him like obituaries. One officer remembered his face, pale, drawn, eyes sunk deep, as if he too had been submerged. That evening he wrote to his commanders at sea, "Withdraw from the North Atlantic." It was not called a retreat. The wording was careful, technical, but the meaning was unmistakable. The great gamble of starving Britain into surrender was over. Germany had lost the ocean. The order went out, and for the first time in 4 years, the shipping lanes of the Atlantic lay open without fear. The convoys that crossed in the weeks that followed moved almost in disbelief, their captains waiting for torpedoes that never came. The sea remained dangerous storms, still claimed ships, mines still drifted, but the invisible terror beneath the waves had ebbed. The long struggle that had begun in 1939 had reached its turning point in 1943, and its name would be remembered forever: Black May. For the sailors who survived it, the memories would last a lifetime. British escorts recalled the thunder of depth charges rolling off the stern, the brief flare of an explosion far below, the oil slick spreading wide as proof that another enemy had fallen. American pilots spoke of the strange quiet after an attack, when the sea swallowed all sound and only the wreckage floated, silent testimony to both victory and tragedy. And in the bars of Liverpool and Halifax, where news of the turning tide spread, there was relief, but no jubilation. Too many comrades lay beneath those waters. They raised their glasses in silence, to the lost and to the living. And the music that followed was soft, almost reverent. The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but the fear that had defined it was broken. From that month onward, the Allies would carry the war eastward, their convoys thick with men and supplies bound for the invasion that would reclaim Europe. The ocean that had once threatened to starve a nation would now feed an army. The wolves had been beaten back, the hunters had become the guardians, and the sea itself seemed to exhale as if relieved of its burden. In that moment, as the last echoes of Black May faded into the endless murmur of the waves, the longest battle of the war had quietly changed its course, and the path to liberation had begun to take shape upon the water. Chapter 12. The ocean becomes a bridge. By the summer of 1943, the Atlantic, once a graveyard of broken hulls and silent despair, began to feel different beneath the ships that crossed it. The air was still cold, the seas still merciless, but something had shifted a rhythm, a confidence that had not been heard since the war began. The convoys no longer crept across the ocean as fugitives. They moved now like arteries pulsing with life, carrying men, food, steel, and fuel toward a Europe waiting to be reclaimed. Where once sailors prayed to survive the crossing, they now spoke of destinations, of ports and missions and homecomings that seemed possible again. The great struggle for the Atlantic was not over, but its soul had changed. The wolves that had haunted it were dying, and in their place rose the hum of engines, the throb of propellers, and the steady breath of nations, rebuilding their strength across the waves. The ocean had become a bridge. Every ship that left New York, Halifax, or Liverpool carried more than cargo. It carried the promise that the world could still be mended. The change was visible not only in charts and statistics, but in the faces of the men who sailed. Merchant sailors who had once counted minutes between torpedo strikes now stood at rails without fear, watching aircraft sweep the skies above them in protective arcs. Escort ships, once thinly scattered and desperate, now formed solid rings of defense, their radar antennas turning like the eyes of sentinels. Liberators patrolled overhead from Iceland to the Azores, and escort carriers sailed alongside, small flat tops, whose decks bristled with fighters, ready to strike the moment a periscope broke the surface. The vastness of the Atlantic, which had always been its curse, was now its strength. Each mile was guarded by the machinery of an alliance that had learned through suffering to think as one. The once fragile chain between continents had hardened into an unbreakable lifeline, binding America, Canada, and Britain together in a unity forged by fear and tempered in victory. For the first time since 1939, the sea did not feel like an enemy, it felt like an ally. To the men who fought beneath its surface, this transformation was almost incomprehensible. The few surviving U-boats still prowled the deep, but they did so as ghosts among giants. The Allied convoys had become floating fortresses, armed to the teeth and surrounded by layers of protection that stretched into the clouds. Even when the Germans struck, their kerplowing with their victories were fleeting, their losses immediate. Every torpedo that found a target summoned retribution from above and below, a storm of sonar pings, depth charges, and screaming aircraft that descended without mercy. Crews who once hunted with confidence now prayed only for escape. The Atlantic, once their domain, now seemed to watch them with eyes that never blinked. In Donitz's headquarters, the reports arrived daily: boats missing, crews lost, contact never re-established. The wolf packs were no longer hunting, they were being hunted to extinction. And yet, out of stubborn pride or despair, they continued to sail, each departure an act of defiance against inevitability. Their commanders spoke of new weapons, the snorkel, the acoustic torpedo, the elusive electroboat, but all of it came too late. The sea no longer waited for innovation, it had already chosen its victor. For the Allies, each safe arrival was a victory measured not in glory but in survival. Every ship that reached Britain brought the war closer to its turning point. Within its holds were the seeds of invasion tanks, landing craft, jeeps, rifles, and the fuel to power them all. On the docks of Liverpool and Glasgow, cranes swung ceaselessly, unloading the material that would one day storm the beaches of Normandy. The flow of supplies became so vast that even the weather seemed to struggle to keep pace. Convoys stretched beyond the horizon, hundreds of ships moving in tight formation, their wakes intertwining like threads of a single tapestry. The air buzzed with radio chatter, coded signals, and the hum of engines. Above all of it hung a sense of purpose so strong, it seemed to steady the sea itself. Sailors spoke of it as a kind of calm and eerie, heavy peace, born not from safety but from conviction. They had seen the worst the ocean could offer, and they had outlasted it. Now, for the first time, they could look toward Europe not as a distant dream, but as a destination to reclaim. In Washington and London, planners studied maps with quiet intensity. Operation Overlord, the greatest invasion in history, would depend not on generals or divisions alone, but on the steady pulse of the Atlantic lifeline. Without it, there could be no build-up, no D-Day, no liberation. Every bullet fired on French soil, every tank that rolled through Normandy, every meal eaten by a soldier on the front line would begin its journey on a ship sailing across that ocean. The admirals and convoy masters understood this better than anyone. To them, victory did not come in explosions or heroics, it came in tonnage delivered, in routes held open, in the unbroken rhythm of ships that left one shore and reached another. They fought not for headlines but for continuity, the quiet miracle of supply. It was the kind of war the world rarely noticed, yet it was the foundation of every triumph that followed. When Eisenhower later said that the Battle of the Atlantic was the prerequisite to victory in Europe, he spoke not from poetry but from truth. Without those ships, the war would have starved before it ever reached the beaches. Yet beneath this industrial symphony lay the same human toll that had marked every phase of the battle. Even as Allied dominance grew, men still died in cold waters. Mines still drifted. Storms still tore ships apart. Engines failed. Fires broke out. And the ocean claimed what it pleased, indifferent to flags or faith. The sailors knew this and respected it. Their confidence was not arrogance but understanding. They had learned to live with the sea's moods, to read its language in the shape of clouds and the sound of waves. They spoke of it as one might speak of an old adversary who had finally learned restraint, a force that could be survived, not conquered. When they looked at the horizon now, it no longer seemed endless in hostility but infinite in memory. Beneath those gray swells lay the wrecks of friends and enemies alike, iron tombs scattered across a world of silence. The Atlantic had become not just a route or a battlefield, but a memorial, a vast, living graveyard that carried within it the story of all who had dared its depths. For the civilians on both sides of the ocean, the difference was life itself. In Britain, shelves that had once stood empty began to fill again. Bread lines shortened, factories roared back to full production, and children heard the word convoy, not as a whisper of fear, but as a promise of plenty. In America, the shipyards along the eastern seaboard worked day and night, launching Liberty ships faster than names could be painted on their hulls. In Canada, the Royal Navy's young sailors, once dismissed as inexperienced, had become veterans, leading escort groups with a discipline that earned them respect from every fleet in the world. The nations that had once trembled at the wolf packs now stood together as masters of the sea. And through this unity, born of shared loss and perseverance, came the first true light of hope that the war could be won not someday, but soon. The Germans saw this light too, though for them it burned with the bitterness of futility. In the remaining U-boat pens, men repaired boats already doomed, fitting them with snorkels and acoustic torpedoes that would not change their fate. The younger recruits no longer believed the speeches. They had grown up hearing that the sea was Germany's ally. Now they knew it was their executioner. When they left port, they did so quietly, without bands or ceremony, disappearing into a horizon that would not forgive them. Some still fought bravely, sinking ships in isolated bursts of vengeance, but it changed nothing. The Atlantic no longer cared who claimed it. It had been transformed from a battlefield of domination into a highway of deliverance. As 1944 approached, the sea that had once been the world's greatest obstacle became its greatest weapon. The convoys multiplied, the escorts grew bolder, and the ocean thrummed with purpose. The ships that crossed no longer symbolized fear. They symbolized inevitability. Beneath them lay wreckage and ruin. Yes, but also renewal. The same waters that had swallowed thousands were now carrying hope in their place. When sailors looked into the waves at night and saw the phosphorescent glow of their wake, they said it looked like ghosts lighting the path home. Perhaps it was, for the dead had not been forgotten. They had become part of the journey itself. The Battle of the Atlantic, once fought in isolation and desperation, was now the foundation upon which liberation would stand. The ocean that had divided continents had become the bridge that would reunite them. Chapter 13: The Dying Wolves. By early 1944, the sea that had once whispered victory to the gray wolves now murmured their requiem, its vast expanse, no longer a hunting ground, but a graveyard of ambitions swallowed by the tide. The Atlantic had turned against them, reshaped by technology, by patience, and by the sheer industrial will of the Allies, who now ruled both sky and sea. In the harbors of France, the U-boat pens still echoed with the clang of steel and the shouts of mechanics. But those sounds, once alive with purpose, had taken on the hollow ring of futility. Karl Donitz still spoke of innovation, of a coming rebirth for his fleet through new designs and miracle weapons. But the men under his command had stopped believing in salvation. They knew that every patrol sent westward into the Atlantic was a wager against death, and the odds had grown unbearable. The once mighty wolf packs were reduced to scattered remnants, clinging to the illusion of control even as radar, sonar, and aircraft conspired against them. They sailed because duty demanded it, not because they thought they would return. Above them, liberators prowled the skies in endless shifts. Below them, the depth charges of destroyers waited like beating hearts in the dark. Even before leaving port, the submariners could hear the sea calling them home, not to victory, but to silence. The technological marvels that had once promised redemption now mocked their creators with bitter irony. The snorkel, hailed as the device that would restore stealth to the U-boats, became instead a suffocating curse. Its thin mast, rising just above the waves, betrayed them to Allied radar almost as easily as surfacing had before. Salt water poured through its valves, flooding engines and choking crews with toxic fumes. Men lived for days in air thick with carbon monoxide, their skin gray from exhaustion and their lungs burning from lack of oxygen. The walls dripped with condensation, food spoiled, tempers frayed, and every creak of the hull sounded like the whisper of doom. They called it the Iron Coffin, even in the best of times, but now it truly felt like one, not a machine of war, but a steel tomb, drifting beneath the weight of the ocean. Donitz's new electro-boats, sleek and swift in theory, emerged from shipyards too late, their promise buried under the rubble of Allied bombing campaigns. Only a handful ever sailed, and fewer still returned. They were magnificent vessels trapped in a war that no longer had a place for them, proof that brilliance without time is nothing but tragedy. Even the acoustic torpedoes that once terrified escorts had been countered by decoys and countermeasures, their menace dulled within months. For every German advance, the Allies answered with 3 of their own, an unstoppable tide of adaptation that swept away hope as surely as the currents swept away wreckage. The Allied hunter-killer groups, built around small escort carriers and agile destroyers, became the new predators of the sea. No longer tethered to convoys, they roamed freely across the Atlantic, tracking radio signals, sniffing out snorkels, and descending upon their prey with a precision that felt mechanical. Above, aircraft circled like hawks. Below, sonar pulses mapped the depths with uncanny accuracy. When a contact was found, the ocean erupted in fury. Hedgehogs, depth charges, and rockets pounded the deep, until oil, debris, and silence rose to the surface. There was no romance left in these battles, no duels of hunter and hunted, only annihilation delivered by machines perfected for the task. Yet even amid the cold efficiency of this new warfare, there was humanity, weary sailors staring at screens for hours, air crews flying endless patrols over gray seas, destroyer captains who mourned every sinking even as they celebrated survival. They, too, understood the cost. They had watched friends vanish into the waves, had seen the Atlantic devour men of every uniform and language. Victory was necessary, but it was never clean. The sea made sure of that. In Germany, propaganda still spoke of the invincible U-boat arm, but in the coastal towns of the Reich, mothers stopped listening. They had seen too many telegrams, too many black-clad widows walking to churches that rang no bells. In Kiel and Hamburg, the streets near the shipyards grew quieter each month as the young men vanished into the deep and never came back. 90% of those who sailed in U-boats would not live to see peace. It was the highest casualty rate of any service in the modern age, a toll so staggering that even victory could not have justified it. The survivors, a handful of gaunt, hollow-eyed men, returned to find their homes bombed and their cities in ruins. They spoke little of what they had endured. Some could not bear to speak at all. They had seen their world collapse from beneath them, crushed by depth charges and guilt in equal measure. For Dönitz, the burden was heavier still. The architect of the wolf pack, the man who had once commanded the Atlantic through fear alone, now presided over a fleet that was dying by inches. He still met his officers with the same clipped discipline, but in private he knew the truth that his masterpiece had become his monument. Every U-boat lost was another chapter in a story that could only end in surrender. For the Allies, the ocean had transformed from a graveyard into a highway of triumph. The convoys that once crept through darkness now moved with confidence, escorted by carriers, destroyers, and aircraft that never left their watch. Merchant sailors who had once whispered prayers now sang as they worked, their fear tempered by faith in the machines that guarded them. In the skies above, the Liberators and Sunderlands flew in disciplined arcs, tracing invisible nets that stretched from Newfoundland to the Bay of Biscay. In shipyards from Halifax to Belfast, new vessels slid down ramps in a near-constant rhythm, replacing every loss before it could be mourned. The balance of production was so lopsided that Germany could no longer hope to compete. American industry poured steel into the sea faster than the U-boats could destroy it, overwhelming the arithmetic of warfare. The Wolfpacks were not defeated by courage alone, but by calculation, by an alliance that understood that endurance was its own kind of weapon. The battle that had begun as a contest of tonnage had become a contest of time, and time was no longer on Germany's side. Yet for all their dominance, the Allies never forgot the fragility of their victory. Storms still claimed ships. The ocean still took lives without reason. Radar could fail, engines could stall, and a single torpedo could undo months of progress. Every sailor knew it, and that knowledge gave their triumph humility. They respected the sea because they had earned its respect in return. When they looked out at the horizon, they saw not an enemy defeated but an endurance shared. For even the Germans, dying in their steel coffins beneath those same waves, had fought with a bravery that could not be denied. The war had pitted technology against technology, but beneath it all were men. Men who feared, who hoped, who won, prayed to the same indifferent waters. When the end finally came in 1945, when Dönitz ordered the last submarines to surface and surrender, it was not celebration that filled the Atlantic, but a strange quiet. Ships of all nations crossed the same waters again, no longer as hunters or hunted, but as survivors of something that had consumed too much of the world's soul. In that silence, the legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic took shape not as a victory of one side over another, but as proof of what endurance could achieve. The ocean had humbled empires, tested alliances, and demanded more from humanity than any battlefield on land ever could. It had shown that survival was not granted by strength alone, but by adaptation, by unity, by the courage to learn from failure. The war beneath the waves had forged the modern world, a world where ships, aircraft, and intelligence worked as one, where the future of war would be fought as much with code and signal as with gun and shell. And as the sea calmed, as the wrecks settled into the silt and the last survivors returned home, the Atlantic itself seemed to breathe again. It had seen too much, carried too much, and yet it endured as it always had, vast and eternal, keeper of both victory and loss. The wolves were gone, but their echoes remained, whispering through the depths that no war, however great, could ever truly conquer the sea. Chapter 14, The Human Tide. By 1944, the sea had consumed so much life that even victory tasted of salt and grief. Every wave seemed to carry echoes of voices long gone, and every sunrise above the Atlantic shone over both triumph and tomb. The war was shifting toward its end, but for those who had lived it upon the water, time itself seemed suspended between memory and duty. The ocean no longer belonged to nations, it belonged to the ghosts. Sailors who crossed its surface felt it in their bones, an invisible weight that pressed down from the gray sky and rose up from the bottom, deep. They had seen too much to believe in glory, and too little peace to believe in safety. Even when the enemy's power had been broken, even when the U-boats lay rotting in their pens, the survivors carried within them the rhythm of that endless struggle, the crash of depth charges, the scream of aircraft, the pounding of waves against steel. Many never slept soundly again. The Battle of the Atlantic had been fought not only with ships and weapons, but but with minds and nerves stretched beyond endurance. It was a war measured in hours of waiting, in nights spent listening for sounds that meant death, in the quiet courage of men who refused to yield to fear. And when it finally began to ebb, it left behind not just wrecks and statistics, but an entire generation bound together by the sea's merciless embrace. On the Allied side, there was pride, but also guilt. In the bars of Liverpool, Halifax, and Boston, sailors toasted the end of the U-boat menace, but their eyes often drifted toward the empty stools beside them. They spoke softly of friends who had gone down with their ships, of convoys lost to storms or torpedoes, of the endless funerals without bodies. The women who waited for them on the docks had learned to smile through uncertainty, their faces carved by the long discipline of hope. Letters written months earlier arrived after news of death, and yet were kept like sacred relics, inked voices from before the silence. In Britain, mothers hung gold stars in their windows and rationed joy like sugar. In America, shipyard workers wept when a telegram arrived for one of their own, because even builders of ships understood that each vessel launched was also a gamble with fate. The Battle of the Atlantic had taught entire nations to live with absence, to measure love in terms of endurance. For the Germans, the human toll was unbearable. In the seaside towns of the Reich, the once proud songs of the U-boat arm were now sung only in mourning. Families gathered around photographs of sons who would never grow old, staring at faces frozen in black and white. The propaganda that had once painted these men as heroes of the deep could no longer hide the truth. The wolf pack had been slaughtered. Out of 40,000 men who served in U-boats, 30,000 were dead. 90 out of every 100 never returned. They were not martyrs to a cause, they were victims of its arrogance. And yet, among their comrades and families, grief was complicated by pride. These were not cowards or monsters. They were men who had done their duty in the only world they knew, trapped in a machinery that cared nothing for them. When the survivors of the submarine arm marched in silence at the war's end, their boots echoing through the ruins of Germany, the sound carried all the way to the sea, a dirge for a generation that had lived and died beneath its waves. The ocean, indifferent yet eternal, seemed to absorb all these human contradictions. To the men who returned to it in peacetime, it was no longer just water, it was memory made visible. Merchant sailors who stayed at sea after the war often spoke of moments when, in the moonlight, they felt they were not alone. They would look over the side of a ship and see phosphorescent trails glowing faintly in the wake, and swear they could almost hear singing beneath the waves. Some said it was superstition. Others said it was the sea remembering. The Atlantic had become a vast, unmarked cemetery, holding more than 70,000 lives within its depths, Allied and Axis, sailor and civilian alike. There were no headstones, no graves, only coordinates and silence. Yet to those who survived, it was sacred ground. When convoys sailed again in peacetime, they followed routes lined with invisible ghosts. Every splash, every ripple, every gull seemed to bear witness. The psychological toll was not confined to the water. On land, the Battle of the Atlantic had left its mark in quieter ways. Children grew up with fate, fathers who rarely spoke, men whose dreams were filled with pressure hulls groaning under depth-charge attack. Wives learned to recognize the distant look in their husbands' eyes, the 1,000-yard stare of men who had once listened for death in the static hiss of sonar. Some veterans found peace in silence, others in storytelling. In British pubs and American diners, they would sometimes lean forward and begin with the same phrase, "You wouldn't believe what it was like out there," and then stop, as if realizing that no one truly could. For them, the ocean was both enemy and companion, the one constant that remained when everything else was gone. But not all of the human tide was sorrow. There was also resilience, an almost miraculous renewal of faith in life. The same sailors who had seen horror beyond words were the ones who later captained ships that carried aid to a starving Europe. The same aircraft that had once hunted submarines now dropped supplies and letters instead of bombs. In this transformation lay the quiet triumph of humanity over destruction. The war had forged a brotherhood of the sea that transcended borders. British and American veterans sometimes met their former enemies years later, shaking hands over museum displays of rusted torpedoes and relics from the depths. They spoke not of revenge, but of survival. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that war was never won by killing, but by enduring. The end of the Battle of the Atlantic did not erase its cost, it transformed it into remembrance. In towns across Britain, Canada, and Germany, memorials rose near harbors where men had once departed and never returned. Simple stones engraved with names, or in some cases with none at all. Every May, wreaths were cast into the sea, floating briefly before vanishing beneath the surface, as if returning to the souls waiting below. In the Royal Navy's tradition, the ocean itself remained the eternal tomb. They have no grave, but the sea. And so, the ocean that had once been divided by hatred became, in the end, a shared grave of reconciliation. When the war finally ended in 1945, sailors on both sides stood on decks and watched the horizon in silence. The sea was calm that day, as if aware of the meaning of its stillness. For the first time in years, no torpedo threatened beneath, no aircraft scouted above. The sound that replaced war was the sound of waves lapping against hulls, a rhythm as old as time, indifferent yet comforting. The Battle of the Atlantic had lasted nearly 6 years, longer than any other campaign of the war. It had taken more lives than many entire land battles, yet it had remained unseen, fought in fog and darkness by men who rarely received the glory their endurance deserved. But in that moment, under a sky washed clean by rain, they felt something close to peace. They had carried the world on their shoulders, and the world had survived. In the years that followed, ships sailed again across a quieter Atlantic, carrying emigrants, food, and hope instead of death. The sea, though scarred by wrecks, resumed its timeless work of connecting continents. Yet every sailor who crossed it after the war carried a silent respect for what it had demanded. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a story of ships and torpedoes. It was a story of people, of ordinary men who faced the impossible and endured. It was the story of the human tide that flows through every generation, rising and falling but never ceasing. And in that endless motion lies the truest victory of all, not conquest, but continuation. The war had ended, but the ocean remained, vast and eternal, reflecting the stars above and the memories below. Beneath its surface slept the heroes and victims alike, united at last in the quiet they had all longed for. Chapter 15: Echoes Beneath the Waves. The war was over, but the ocean did not forget. Long after the guns fell silent and the banners of peace were raised over cities, the Atlantic continued to murmur the stories of those who had vanished within its depths. To most of the world, the Battle of the Atlantic became a line in a history book, a campaign of tonnage, statistics, and dates. But to the sea, it remained a living memory. Beneath its gray surface lay the wrecks of Liberty ships, U-boats, tankers, and destroyers, their hulls rusting quietly in the cold darkness. Each one was a fragment of human history, frozen in time. A cup still on a table, a boot near a hatch, a name carved into steel by a sailor who never came home. The ocean became their keeper, its tides whispering over them in an endless lullaby. Divers who descended decades later spoke of the eerie calm that surrounded those underwater tombs. The deeper they went, the more it felt like entering a cathedral, columns of light filtering through water. Silence so vast, it pressed against the chest like a heartbeat. The Battle of the Atlantic had not ended with surrender. It had merely sunk beneath the waves, to rest among the currents and silt, where memory never truly fades. Above the surface, the nations rebuilt, and life returned to the ports once choked by war. In Liverpool, children played on docks where convoys had once formed under blackout skies. In Halifax, old shipyard cranes stood silent, their rusted arms reaching toward clouds that no longer smelled of smoke. In Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire, The massive U-boat pens built to defy even the fiercest bombing remained as scars of concrete and shadow, monuments to both ambition and futility. Tourists walked their corridors decades later, tracing fingers over walls still pitted by shrapnel, feeling the cold breath of history on their necks. Time had softened the politics of it all. The hatred, the fear, the triumph, and what remained was something quieter, deeper, more human. The war that had once divided nations now united them in remembrance. British, German, American, and Canadian veterans met as old men, shaking hands across tables, their laughter weary but sincere. They spoke not of enemies but of endurance, of nights when the sea had tested them all and spared only a few. "We were just boys," one of them said softly, "and the ocean made us old." For historians, the Battle of the Atlantic came to symbolize more than a military campaign. It became the measure of what humanity could endure when everything was at stake. It was the longest continuous battle of the Second World War, lasting from 1939 to 1945, spanning 6 years, 5 continents, and tens of thousands of lives. Without victory there, no victory anywhere else would have been possible. Every landing craft that touched Normandy's beaches, every bomber that flew from British airfields, every tank that rolled into France owed its existence to the ships that had survived the Atlantic. And yet, for all its strategic significance, the battle's heart was profoundly human. It was fought by men who spent months in darkness, who learned to navigate by instinct and hope, who lived and died in metal shells the size of railway cars. They faced storms that could split ships in half, depth charges that shook the soul loose from the body, loneliness so deep it blurred the line between courage and madness. It was a war of endurance, of waiting, of listening for the sound that meant death or survival. And in that waiting, in that patience and pain, humanity revealed its truest face not in conquest, but in resilience. The ocean, for its part, remained the same, vast, indifferent, eternal. It does not care who wins or loses. It remembers only those who pass through it. The same waters that swallowed U-boats now cradle fishing boats, freighters, and passenger liners. The same currents that once carried convoys now carry travelers and trade. Yet, if one listens closely, the echoes remain. On calm nights, sailors swear they can hear distant thuds, like depth charges rolling off a bough, forgotten stern. Others say the sea sometimes glows faintly, where wrecks lie beneath, as if the souls of the lost still send up light from the deep. These are only legends, of course. But perhaps legends are how the human heart keeps truth alive when words are not enough. For the sea is not just water, it is memory in motion, the collective breath of all who ever faced it and lived to tell the tale. In the decades that followed, the Battle of the Atlantic faded into the background of modern life, overshadowed by more visible stories of tanks, battles, and liberation. But for those who knew the ocean, it never truly ended. The Royal Navy's traditions still pause to honor the silent service, the submariners, the merchantmen, the escorts, and the air crews who fought in a war without front lines. Each year, ceremonies are held at sea, where wreaths are cast into the water, and the last post is played against the wind. For a moment, all is still. The waves roll softly against the hulls, as if the ocean itself bows its head. The words spoken at those ceremonies are simple, almost whispered. They have no grave but the sea. And in that line lies everything: the loss, the peace, the eternity. To the modern world, the Atlantic now feels tamed, mapped, charted, crossed by airplanes in hours. But beneath that illusion of control lies the same wild force that once decided the fate of nations. The sea can still rise, can still take back what it has given. Perhaps that is why the story of the Battle of the Atlantic endures not as nostalgia, but as warning. It reminds us that progress always comes with a price, that survival demands humility, and that courage often means persistence rather than glory. The men and women who lived through it did not see themselves as heroes. They were ordinary people, doing an impossible job, holding a line no one could see so that others could live. Their victory was not in the ships they saved or the enemies they sank, but in the fact that they never surrendered to despair. And so, when one stands today on a quiet shore and looks out over the Atlantic, it is easy to imagine that beneath those waves, the echoes still drift, sonar pings fading into the distance, propellers slowing to stillness, the last heartbeat of a vanished crew. The ocean does not speak in words, but if it did, it might say this: that courage is not loud, that endurance is not glamorous, that the truest victories are those that leave no monuments. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war fought in shadows, but it shaped the light that followed. Every sunrise over that water carries its legacy. Every gull that glides over its swells is a messenger for those who never returned. The ocean keeps them, the world remembers them, and in the hush between the waves their story continues, forever flowing, forever echoing, beneath the tides of time. Chapter 16. The Tide Turns. By the spring of 1943, the Atlantic had begun to change its color, not in the gray of weathered waves, but in the rhythm of power that moved beneath them. For years, the sea had belonged to the hunters, to the sleek black silhouettes of U-boats that prowled like shadows under the moon, each one the spear of Germany's will. Yet now, the tide that had so long favored them began to shift, first subtly, then unmistakably, as if the ocean itself had grown weary of surrendering its depths to war. The convoys that once sailed trembling now carried a new confidence, and in that confidence, the balance of the longest battle in history began to tilt. The Allied fleets, strengthened by the lessons of blood and loss, no longer moved blindly through the Atlantic. Each convoy was a living organism, its escorts, the shield, its merchantmen, the heart, and the men who crewed them were hardened by years of fear turned into focus. They had learned the patterns of the wolf packs, the scent of danger in the night, the faint shimmer of periscope glass on the horizon, and with every braid crossing, they grew stronger, while the hunters who stalked them began to bleed. New technologies had matured quietly in workshops and laboratories while the sea raged. Radar had grown sharp enough to pierce fog and darkness. Sonar precise enough to hear even the whisper of a submerged engine. Aircraft, once grounded by range, now patrolled far into the ocean's black heart, their shadows falling even across the dreaded mid-Atlantic gap. Each tool, each tactic, was a response to a lesson paid for in lives. The Battle of the Atlantic had become not merely a contest of endurance, but a crucible of innovation, and by 1943, the results began to show. Convoy HX-229 and SC-122 still suffered brutally that March, their decks aflame, their cargo lost, but even as they burned, their escorts learned. They struck back harder, faster, with coordination that surprised the enemy. Destroyers no longer fled from sonar contacts but surged toward them, driving depth charges into the abyss like thunderclaps of vengeance. Above, patrol aircraft swooped without warning, their bombs and rockets scattering the surface with white eruptions of foam. The sea, once the hunter's refuge, was becoming his trap. For the German U-boat crews, the transformation was like waking into a nightmare. The ocean that had once been their silent ally now betrayed them at every turn. Surfaces that had offered safety were illuminated by radar pulses, invisible to the eye. The night sky, once their cloak, now hid wings of death. They called it the New War, a war they could neither see nor escape. Reports to Donetsk grew darker with each passing week. Boats lost without trace, captains unheard from, patrols vanishing mid-message. Yet duty was iron, and he demanded they continue. The men obeyed, though many understood the truth, that the sea had turned against them. Still, they sailed. Still, they dove beneath the waves that had swallowed their brothers. Each patrol became an act of defiance, a journey into silence, knowing that silence might never end. And while Germany's shipyards built faster, they could not replace the men, the trained commanders, the seasoned crews who disappeared into the deep. The rhythm of the Atlantic War, once a song of German triumph, was slowing, faltering, changing key. By May, the Allies' weapons had matured into mastery. Hedgehog mortars, high-frequency direction finding, and depth-charge barrages that could track a U-boat across miles of open sea turned the battle from defense to pursuit. The hunted convoys had become predators. The ocean itself seemed to echo with a grim reversal. The hunter now breathing in fear, the prey now armed with knowledge. Convoy ONS-5 became the symbol of this transformation. 43 merchant ships, crossing westward from Liverpool, found themselves under attack by 40-odd U-boats, the largest wolf pack yet assembled. For days, the battle raged under storm-tossed skies. Ships burned, torpedoes struck, men died in freezing waters, but the escorts refused to yield. They fought like men possessed, guided by radar and courage. In the chaos, 7 U-boats were destroyed, 7 wolves silenced forever. For the Allies, it was the moment when defense became victory. For Germany, it was the beginning of the end. When the smoke cleared, the Atlantic lay scarred but changed. The convoys still bled, but they bled less. The hunters were dying faster than they could kill. In London, Washington, and Ottawa, the Admiralty charts began to show a new pattern. Fewer sinkings, more safe arrivals, a curve bending toward survival. The tide had turned. And though the war was far from over, the men who sailed those convoys knew, deep in their bones, that history had shifted. The wolves had lost their pack. The sea, that ancient judge, had chosen its side. Chapter 17. Black May. By May 1943, the Atlantic had become a graveyard of ambitions, a place where steel, salt, and silence swallowed the last illusions of German invincibility. What began as a campaign of shadows had turned into a reckoning beneath the waves. And that month, forever remembered as Black May, marked the moment when the wolves were hunted to extinction. The U-boat arm, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine and the terror of Allied sailors, was bleeding out faster than new boats could rise from the shipyards. Donitz's dream of strangling Britain into submission was collapsing beneath the weight of mathematics and mortality. 41 submarines were lost in those 31 days, 41 iron coffins, thousands of men entombed in the cold dark, where no prayer could reach. They were hunted not by chance, but by mastery. Aircraft that swept the skies from Iceland to the Azores, escort carriers bristling with Avengers and Wildcats, destroyers whose radar could pierce the night, and sonar that sang the song of death beneath the waves. The sea that had once sheltered the hunter now betrayed him, and the Atlantic that once whispered promises of victory now murmured only despair. In every harbor, from Brest to Street Nazaire, widows waited for boats that would never return. Germany's silent service had become the silent dead. The turning of the tide was not sudden, but Black May made it undeniable. For 4 years, the Allies had endured their ships torn apart, their sailors drowned in oil and flame, their supplies dwindling, but in 1943, endurance became dominance. The convoy escorts, once outnumbered and outgunned, now sailed in strength. Their destroyers and corvettes formed rings of steel that no submarine could penetrate without risk of annihilation. Above them, aircraft patrolled with ruthless precision, their engines a constant reminder that the sky now belonged to the Allies. Long-range liberators closed the infamous Mid-Atlantic Gap, turning the Black Pit into a hunting ground of their own. The very tools of survival had evolved into instruments of supremacy. Radar no longer merely warned, it guided attacks. Sonar no longer searched blindly, it hunted with intent. Hedgehogs exploded only when they struck steel, and they struck often. Ultra-intelligence from Bletchley Park read the enemy's secrets like an open book, rerouting convoys away from ambushes and directing hunter-killer groups toward unsuspecting wolf packs. Every move the U-boats made, every whisper of their radio traffic, was echoed back to the Allies through the quiet brilliance of mathematicians and cryptographers. It was not only courage that had turned the tide, but comprehension. The Allies now understood the ocean as the Germans once had, and with that understanding came power. For the men of the U-boat fleet, the change was felt in every breath of diesel and every heartbeat beneath the crushing weight of the sea. Patrols grew shorter, not from success, but from failure. Each dive became a prayer, each surfacing a gamble with death. They were no longer the hunters of 1940, grinning beneath their caps as British tonnage burned in the distance. They were men waiting for fate in the iron corridors of their boats. The air stank of oil and fear. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by the distant thud of depth charges. Many crews never even saw their enemy, only felt the ocean shudder and the hull groan before everything ended. For those who survived, the silence afterward was worse than the noise. They would surface to empty seas, the stars reflected in oil-slick water, wondering why they were alive when so many were gone. Letters from home spoke of glory, but they no longer believed it. Glory did not smell like diesel and death. It did not sound like the hiss of air as ballast tanks filled for a final dive. By the end of May, Donitz could no longer deny the truth. His wolves were dying faster than they could hunt. He ordered a withdrawal from the North Atlantic, a retreat masked as reorganization, but known to every sailor as surrender. The U-boat arm would fight on, but its beef, the age of dominance, was over. For the Allies, Black May was not triumph without tears. Each convoy that reached port carried ghosts with it, names whispered in mess halls, faces remembered in silence. Escort ships returned with dented hulls, missing comrades, and the haunted eyes of men who had seen the sea at its cruelest. They had not merely defeated an enemy, they had outlasted the ocean itself. But in their endurance lay a quiet pride, the knowledge that they had held the line through years when hope was scarce. The convoys that had once limped into Liverpool, with half their ships missing, now arrived almost intact, their holds bursting with food, fuel, and weapons. Britain, once starving, began to breathe again. The lifeline was secure, the wolves were broken, and for the first time since 1939, the Atlantic belonged not to the hunter, but to the sailor. The Admiralty's charts told the story in red and blue. Fewer sinkings, more arrivals, more freedom. Each safe voyage was a heartbeat of victory. Each cargo delivered was a promise kept. Yet beneath the statistics lay something deeper, a shift in spirit. The men who had fought this invisible war were no longer merely defenders of trade routes. They were guardians of civilization's breath. They had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. In the war's early days, the Atlantic had been a place of fear, a graveyard of convoys. But by the summer of 1943, it became a symbol of resilience. The storm had not broken them, it had refined them. The Battle of the Atlantic had forged a generation of sailors, aviators, and civilians whose courage was quiet but unbreakable. They did not fight for glory, but for tomorrow, and by May 1943, tomorrow had begun to dawn. The wolves had howled their last, and the sea, that old and merciless judge, had passed its verdict. In its cold embrace, the dreams of domination sank, leaving only silence and the steady hum of engines carrying life across the waves once more. Black May had closed a chapter of terror and opened one of triumph. A triumph not of power, but of perseverance. Chapter 18. Shadows Beneath the Waves. By the summer of 1943, the wolves no longer ruled the sea. Yet the war beneath the waves did not die easily. It lingered in the cold darkness where sunlight never reached, a ghostly echo of the once terrifying pack that had hunted the world's lifeline. The U-boat arm, shattered in numbers but not in spirit, fought on out of habit, pride, and desperation. Their bases in occupied France still launched patrols, small, frightened, and uncertain missions that slipped into the Atlantic like whispers. The men aboard them were younger now, many scarcely out of training, faces pale beneath the dim red glow of the control room lights. They had heard stories of the happy times, of the glory days, when convoys burned from horizon to horizon, and the ocean seemed theirs to command. But those stories belonged to another world. Their war was one of silence and survival, of creeping through sonar nets and praying that the pings would fade instead of grow louder. Each time the depth charges fell, the boat would shudder as if struck by the fist of God, bolts rattling loose, lights flickering, and men gripping pipes with white knuckles as water seeped through the seams. Some would whisper prayers, others stared blankly, waiting for the next explosion. Yet somehow, through exhaustion and instinct, they carried on. Above them, the ocean was no longer empty. The Allies had filled it with eyes, radar-scanning aircraft, destroyers equipped with high-frequency direction finders, and hunter-killer groups that roamed freely, unbound by convoys. The balance had flipped so completely that the very tactics once used by the U-boats were now employed against them. Destroyer groups spread in wide arcs, sharing sonar data over new radio links, triangulating echoes until no hiding place remained. Escort carriers released aircraft in tight rotation, their pilots hunting submarines as wolves once hunted ships. Every ping, every flicker of radar, was a signal of death approaching. The Atlantic had become a living machine of detection and destruction. For the U-boats, it was no longer a battlefield, it was a cage. Patrols that once stretched for weeks now ended within days. Some boats were bombed before they reached the open sea, caught by liberators prowling the Bay of Biscay. Others vanished without a word, slipping into the deep where only wreckage told their story. Even the survivors carried the weight of futility, knowing that victory was no longer possible. Their missions had become rituals, gestures of loyalty to a dying cause. Yet even in defeat, the courage of these men was undeniable. They fought not because they still believed in triumph, but because they could not stop. To refuse a patrol meant shame. To survive, one was a miracle. Inside the cramped steel hulls, they endured a life few could imagine. The air thickened with oil, fumes, and carbon monoxide. Sweat dripped from the ceiling in humid condensation. Rations grew moldy. Water tasted of rust. A single depth charge could pitch them into chaos, sending tools flying, pipes bursting, men gasping in blackness as the boat lurched into a dive. Sleep came only in fragments, each man haunted by the sound of the ocean pressing against the hull, a sound that reminded them of their coffin's walls. When they surfaced, it was only to gulp air, charge batteries, and scan the empty horizon for a sky that might kill them. Every dawn was a reprieve, every dusk a sentence. And yet, in those fleeting moments of calm, when the engines hummed and the sea glittered under moonlight, even the hunted felt something close to peace. They were sailors still, bound to the rhythm of tides older than war itself. The Allies, for their part, knew that victory was not only about killing submarines, but about keeping men alive long enough to reach the war's end. The convoys had become chains of endurance, moving fortresses, protected by the coordination of ships, aircraft, and intelligence unseen. In Liverpool and Halifax, ports once filled with wreckage now thrummed with confidence. Shipyards repaired hulls, launched replacements, and sent them out faster than Germany could sink them. In command centers deep underground, analysts at Bletchley Park decrypted U-boat transmissions in near real time, turning every message into a map of opportunity. Convoy routes curved elegantly away from danger, sometimes by mere hours, saving thousands of lives through mathematics and secrecy. The men at sea never knew who saved them. They simply arrived safely, unaware that silent minds in England had bent the course of fate on their behalf. The Atlantic War was no longer chaos, it was choreography, and the Allies danced it with precision. For Germany, each lost submarine was more than a weapon destroyed. It was another wound to morale. Families received telegrams stamped with the same cold phrase: missing, presumed lost. Mothers stopped counting the days since departure. Wives stopped writing letters. Dönitz, now the head of the Kriegsmarine, still believed in the submarine as Germany's salvation. He spoke of new technologies, the snorkel that would allow boats to breathe underwater, the new electro-boats that would outpace their enemies, but these promises arrived too late. Production faltered under Allied bombing, and the new designs were trapped in blueprints while the old boats died in the field. Still, the propaganda machine churned, telling citizens that the Atlantic would soon be reclaimed. But in the ports, the truth was plain. Fewer boats returned, and those that did were battered beyond recognition. Crews stepped ashore gaunt and hollow-eyed, haunted by the sounds that followed them into sleep. The echo of sonar pings, the thunder of depth charges, the scream of rupturing steel. Meanwhile, the ocean itself seemed to remember. Its surface carried the oil slicks of battles long past, and beneath the waves lay a cemetery without gravestones. The wrecks of freighters and submarines rested side by side, their stories intertwined in the same silence. Fish swam through twisted ladders and shattered hulls, their scales glinting against the ghosts of men who once fought there. The sea, indifferent and eternal, kept their secrets. Historians would later call 1943 the turning point, but for those who lived it, it was something more profound. A shift from fear to acceptance, from chaos to inevitability. The men of the Atlantic had come to understand that the war would end not with a final battle, but with exhaustion. Each voyage, each patrol, was one more heartbeat in a dying rhythm. As autumn approached, the U-boats were no longer predators but survivors. They moved through the Atlantic like shadows fading in daylight, their presence feared less and pitied more. The Allies still hunted them, but the hunt felt different, less a contest of equals, more the slow pursuit of something already lost. Yet even in that final struggle, there was dignity. Each submarine that dove beneath the waves carried with it the memory of thousands who had gone before, of comrades who had never surfaced. They were fragments of a once mighty force that had shaken the world, now reduced to whispers in the dark. The ocean had turned against them, but it had also become their only refuge. And as winter drew near, the Atlantic, vast and merciless, prepared to write its final chapters not in gunfire, but in silence. Chapter 19. The Final Patrols. By late 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had shrunk from a global campaign of survival to a series of desperate, fading echoes. The wolf packs were gone, their names forgotten, their triumphs buried beneath the waves that had once been their empire. The once mighty U-boat fleet had become a scattering of ghosts, boats limping out from their dying bases in France and Norway, manned by boys who were too young to remember the victories their fathers had told them about. They set out under skies filled with Allied bombers, knowing that the sea ahead was no longer theirs to prowl but to perish in. Even leaving port had become a battle. The Bay of Biscay, once a highway of war, was now a graveyard, watched day and night by British and American aircraft that descended without mercy. Every wake was a target, every surfacing drew fire. The sailors called it the Valley of Death, a stretch of water that swallowed them before they ever saw open ocean. Still, the U-boats went, not because they believed in victory, but because turning back meant treason, and because the sea, for all its terror, was still home. Each man knew the odds. They packed extra rations, wrote letters they would never send, and spoke softly to one another as the shoreline faded behind them. Hope had become a form of courage. The submarines that ventured into the Atlantic that winter were different from those of the early war. They carried snorkels, now thin metal tubes that reached above the surface to draw air into the engines while submerged. It was meant to be salvation, a way to remain invisible, to avoid the radar that had become the eyes of death. But the snorkel was a cruel gift. The intake valve jammed in rough seas, flooding compartments with seawater and choking the diesel engines with spray. Exhaust fumes filled the boat, coating lungs with soot and poisoning the air. Men fainted at their posts. Carbon monoxide seeped through every crevice, turning the hull into a steel coffin long before the enemy found them. Commanders cursed as their periscopes fogged, their radar detectors jammed, their oxygen gauges flickered low. The snorkel was survival at the price of suffering. They called it the suffocating tube, and still they used it, because the alternative was surfacing and death. Above them, the Allies ruled the ocean with absolute mastery. Escort carriers now sailed with nearly every convoy, their decks bristling with aircraft that hunted from dawn to dusk. Destroyer escorts, armed with radar and sonar more advanced than any the world had seen, prowled like predators through the dark. Hunter-killer groups, small fleets, built solely to destroy submarines, moved independently, guided by intelligence from Bletchley Park and by the tireless watchers of the skies. When a U-boat was detected, the hunt unfolded like a ritual. Sonar pings marked the rhythm, depth charges the percussion, and in between, silence the waiting, the listening, the calculation of where the next explosion must fall. Some hunts lasted hours, others stretched into days, each pass driving the submarine deeper, its air fouling, its systems failing, until it either surfaced in surrender or was crushed beneath the pressure. In the control rooms of the destroyers, men spoke quietly, almost reverently, as they watched oil rise to the surface. They no longer cheered the kill. The enemy was not hated anymore, only pitied. The war beneath the waves had become a slow tragedy, a story written in attrition. Germany still launched new boats, sleeker, faster, more advanced, but it no longer had the fuel, the crews, or the time to use them. The Type XXI electroboats, the marvels that Donitz had promised would reclaim the Atlantic, rolled out of shipyards only to meet a collapsing Reich. They could dive deeper and travel faster than any Allied ship could chase, but their numbers were too few, their crews too untrained, and their purpose already lost. Some never left the Baltic. Others, still unfinished, were bombed in their pens before they could even submerge. The Type 23 coastal submarines fared no better, swift and silent, but trapped in waters already owned by the enemy. For every innovation, the Allies had an answer. Radar grew sharper, sonar clearer, and the sky itself deadlier. The very element that had protected the damned, submariner darkness, was now his undoing. Searchlights mounted on aircraft pierced the night, revealing conning towers and periscopes that had once gone unseen. Even the deep was no refuge. Depth charges reached farther, hit harder, and detonated with precision, guided by sound and calculation. And yet, still, the submariners fought. In their silence and solitude, there was something stubbornly human, a refusal to let go of purpose, even when purpose had vanished. They spoke of duty, of comradeship, of the sea's pull. They fought for each other, for memory, for pride. Some sailed knowing their families had already been lost in the bombings at home. Others clung to faith that one successful patrol might redeem all the failures. In the final months, victory was no longer measured in ships sunk, but in survival. To return from patrol, even once, was an act of defiance against fate. But most did not return. Out of every 10 men who entered the U-boat service, 9 never came back. More than 36,000 sailors were swallowed by the Atlantic, their graves unmarked, their stories untold. The ocean kept them all, German, British, Canadian, American alike, bound together in the cold equality of the deep. On the Allied side, the tone of the war changed too. The sailors who had once prayed for vengeance now prayed simply to go home. Years of storm and death had worn them down to quiet endurance. The sea was no longer their enemy. It was a companion they had learned to fear and respect. They had seen it claim the best of men, both friend and foe. When they pulled survivors from the wreckage of submarines, they no longer saw monsters, only boys. Some were barely 18, faces pale, eyes hollow. The rescuers shared cigarettes with them, wrapped them in blankets, and said nothing. No words could bridge the abyss of what they had lived through. The sea had changed them all. As 1945 dawned, the war that had once burned across continents was fading into ashes, and the Atlantic followed suit. Germany's ports lay in ruins, its fleet was scattered. U-boat bases once teeming with engineers and sailors now echoed with emptiness. The few boats that still sailed did so, knowing the end was near. They patrolled not for conquest, but for dignity, to prove that they had not been broken. Some commanders scuttled their boats rather than surrender them. Others surrendered in silence, raising white sheets on periscopes as Allied destroyers loomed overhead. The ocean accepted them all with the same indifference. The last patrols were not battles, but farewells to comrades, to purpose, to a way of life that would never return. When Germany finally fell in May 1945, the U-boat fleet surrendered en masse. More than 150 submarines were handed over to the Allies. Many scuttled in deep water soon after. Donitz, who had once commanded the Wolves of the Sea, now stood as a defeated leader, issuing orders to end a war that had already ended him. In the harbors, men who had lived years underwater emerged blinking into sunlight, their faces gaunt and gray. They stepped onto the docks quietly, carrying the weight of everything they had seen, everything they had lost. For them, the ocean was no longer a battlefield. It was a memory carved in salt and sorrow. The Atlantic, vast and eternal, rolled on, indifferent to who had won or lost. But in its depths, the ghosts of the war remained, sleeping in their steel coffins, their names carried only by the tides. The longest battle in human history had ended not with a roar, but with a sigh. The sea had consumed everything, ambition, hatred, pride, and returned only silence. Yet in that silence lay peace, the kind that comes only after exhaustion. The ocean, once the cruelest of enemies, became the keeper of their stories. For those who survived, its sound would forever carry echoes of engines and explosions, of laughter and screams, of comrades lost to the deep. For the rest of the world, the Atlantic became what it had always been: a bridge, a boundary, and a grave. Chapter 20. The Ocean's Legacy. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, and the smoke of the last burning ships drifted into the gray Atlantic sky, the sea itself seemed to breathe again. The waves that had carried death for 6 long years now rolled in quiet patterns, as if remembering the weight of all they had seen. Beneath them lay the wrecks of empires and ambitions, the twisted steel of ships that had once carried hope and fear in equal measure. The Battle of the Atlantic had ended, but its echoes would never fade. It was the longest battle of the Second World War, a struggle not for territory, but for survival, fought across an endless expanse of water that had no borders, no flags, no mercy. The ocean had demanded everything from those who sailed it, and it gave nothing back but endurance. Victory, when it came, felt less like triumph and more like relief. The men who had endured it were not conquerors, they were survivors, and for them, peace was not celebration, but silence. The Atlantic had been both cradle and grave, a teacher and a tormentor. It revealed, more clearly than any battlefield, the true nature of war, not glory, but persistence, not hatred, but the desperate will to keep breathing. For the Allied sailors who had guarded the convoys through those years, the end came quietly. One morning, the orders simply stopped. The destroyers no longer formed their screens. The merchant ships no longer sailed in fear. The escort carriers that had once filled the skies with watchful wings turned for home, their pilots exhausted, their decks scarred by salt and time. In ports from Halifax to Liverpool, the survivors stepped ashore into a world that scarcely understood what they had endured. To most, the war's great victories had names: Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway. But the Atlantic had no such glory. Its triumph was invisible, measured only in what did not happen: the fall of Britain, the starvation of its people, the breaking of its lifeline. Those who had fought there knew the truth, that their long, unseen struggle had made every other victory possible. The road to Normandy, to Rome, to Berlin, all began with ships that crossed a sea that refused to yield. For the Germans, defeat at sea was both personal and profound. The U-boat service had once been the pride of the Reich, its commanders hailed as heroes in propaganda reels and radio broadcasts. Now, it was a fleet of ghosts. Of the 40,000 men who had served beneath the waves, more than 36,000 never returned. Their boats lay scattered across the ocean floor, steel tombs sealed forever by pressure and time. The Atlantic was their cemetery, vast and cold, marked only by coordinates in forgotten logs. For the few who survived, the end of the war brought no joy, only exhaustion and grief. They had fought with courage, often believing they were defending their homeland, but they had been sent into an unwinnable struggle against an enemy that outproduced, outsmarted, and outlasted them. In their letters, recovered years later, they wrote not of hatred, but of homesickness, of families, of stars glimpsed through periscope lenses. Even in war, they had looked upward for light. For the Allies, the victory was built on sacrifice beyond measure. The British Merchant Navy lost over 30,000 men civilians who had become soldiers of the sea. They were dock workers, fishermen, farmers, turned mariners, men who sailed knowing that a single torpedo could end their lives in an instant. Their ships carried food, fuel, tanks, and ammunition cargoes that sustained nations, and they paid for every crossing in blood and fear. Their courage was quiet, their recognition delayed, but without them, Britain would have starved, and the war might have been lost. The Royal and Royal Canadian Navies, too, bore immense burdens. Small nations sent their sons into endless storms, across waters where the enemy was invisible, and the sea itself was always waiting. Destroyers and corvettes patrolled through sleepless nights, their crews living on black coffee, nerves, and duty. The men who flew above them, in their Sunderlands and Liberators, stared into horizons that never ended, fighting not just the enemy, but monotony, fatigue, and the knowledge that one mistake could mean a cold death below. Together, they formed the shield that never cracked the living chain that linked continents. But the cost was more than ships and lives, it was memory. In towns along the coasts of Britain, Canada, and Norway, the war left absences that never healed. Wives waited by empty docks. Children grew up with stories instead of fathers. In Germany, too, the grief was silent and suffocating. In the villages of Schleswig and the ports of Kiel, mothers hung photographs beside black candles, praying for sons who would never surface. The war beneath the waves had claimed a generation, and no victory could bring them back. The ocean remembered what the world forgot. To sail across the Atlantic, even decades later, was to pass over thousands of graves unseen, to feel the weight of what was buried below. The sea held its secrets, but it also held its peace. From the war's wreckage emerged lessons that would shape the future of the world. The Battle of the Atlantic proved that wars are not won only by armies or air forces, but by those who sustain them, the unseen, the ordinary, the ones who endure. It proved that courage can be quiet, that victory can be invisible, and that endurance can outlast terror. The convoys had shown the power of unity. Ships from Britain, Canada, the United States, Norway, and dozens of other nations sailing together under one purpose. The radar and sonar that turned the tide became the foundations of modern navigation and exploration. The cryptographers at Bletchley Park, whose minds had pierced the secrets of enigma, laid the groundwork for a future ruled by computers and codes. Even the technology of destruction gave birth to the tools of peace. Out of the depths came understanding, the knowledge that survival itself is a kind of triumph. And yet, beyond all the technology and strategy, the Battle of the Atlantic remains a human story. It is the story of sailors who faced storms and submarines, of pilots who searched the endless sea for a flicker of movement, of engineers who kept fragile machines alive in impossible conditions, of families who waited and hoped and mourned. It is a story not of heroes or villains, but of people who did what they had to do when the world demanded everything. In the end, the ocean was both enemy and ally. It destroyed without thought, but it also preserved the wrecks, the memories, the echoes of those voices carried still in the rhythm of the waves. The sea does not forget. Today, when you stand on the cliffs of the North Atlantic and look out over the gray horizon, the water seems unchanged. The same gulls cry, the same wind cuts through the air, the same waves roll toward unseen shores. But beneath that surface lies history's silence, the steel skeletons of ships, the dreams of nations, the courage of men who never came home. The Atlantic is vast, but not empty. It is filled with stories. Every ripple carries the whispers of the past. The Battle of the Atlantic was not merely a fight for control of a sea, it was a fight for the future of humanity's freedom. It was a reminder that endurance is not weakness, that compassion can coexist with courage, and that peace, when it finally comes, is worth every storm. So, as the tide pulls out once more, carrying the light of dusk across the horizon, remember them, the sailors, the airmen, the submariners, the engineers, the nameless millions who gave the world its tomorrow. Their battle was fought in darkness, but it delivered dawn. The Atlantic, once an arena of terror, became a bridge of hope. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was peace hard-earned, peace paid in full. And though the years have passed, and the waves have washed away the scars, the ocean remembers. Beneath the calm, beneath the reflection of the stars, the legacy of their courage endures forever. Outro. Drift into the silence. And now, as the echoes of the Atlantic fade, as the storms settle and the waves grow still, you can let your mind rest in the calm that follows the chaos. We have traveled together through 6 years of unbroken struggle across frozen seas, through the smoke of burning ships, beneath the waves where the submariners dreamed of sunlight, and into the hearts of those who refused to surrender to fear. You have heard their story not of conquest, but of endurance, of ordinary men and women whose courage was measured not in victories won, but in the simple act of continuing. The Battle of the Atlantic was not the war's loudest chapter, yet it was its heartbeat. Every loaf of bread that reached Britain, every tank that rolled onto Normandy's beaches, every spark of hope that survived through the darkest nights, all of it floated on the courage of those who faced the sea. Tonight, as we drift from their story into silence, remember that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it breathes quietly, beneath the waves. If your eyes grow heavy now, let them close. Feel the hum of distant engines fading into the wind, the rhythm of the waves like a heartbeat beneath your thoughts. The same ocean that once roared with thunder now whispers softly, rocking you toward rest. History is not gone. It moves with us, in every tide, in every moment of peace, bought by sacrifice. The men of the convoys, the sailors of the U-boats, the pilots of the skies, they are not only names carved on memorials, they are part of the water itself, part of the great current of time that carries us all. Their endurance flows through us still, a reminder that even in the darkest depths, humanity finds light. And as the last notes of this story fade, remember the sea endures, and so do we. If you found peace in this journey, if history's voice has guided you gently toward calm, take a moment to breathe, and let gratitude fill the silence. And when you wake, carry with you the knowledge that every calm ocean once endured a storm. This has been Lullaby of Empire, where the past drifts softly into your dreams. If this story touched you, let it continue. Leave a light behind by subscribing so that others may find their way here too. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and may the waves of history carry you gently into tomorrow.